fear and fury. "Very well then," John said dryly. "Lord Moxton, it would seem that we have something of a situation here. When you and your son arrived back here in King's Landing from your rather lengthy business trip to Essos, the exact details of which seem to be rather murky, your son decided to, shall we say, purchase some affection. He seems to have lacked sufficient coin, for reasons that also seem to be murky. There was what I shall describe as a fracas. You arrived at the same time as the city watch, and you then decided that you would try and make the whole thing go away by bribing the guards." He sighed a little and then continued. "When the guards said no, you announced that you wanted to talk to the commander of the Gold Cloaks, one Janos Slynt. When told that Slynt had been dead for many months now, you lost your temper, berated the guards for fools, demanded to see Slynt at once and refused to cooperate. When Sir Davos Seaworth here happened on the scene and announced that he now commands the city watch, you told him that he was a liar and a fool, and then you tried to bribe him as well with a snarl and a further insult. Whereupon you were placed under arrest, you and your fool of a boy. Is that an accurate summary?" Moxton came very close to snarling something in reply, before choking it back, and then nodded choppily. "Lord Arryn, I am sure that this is all a misunderstanding, caused by my long absence from the capital on urgent business, along with my son's foolishness. Your trying to bribe the head of the city watch is just a misunderstanding." Moxton actually curled his lip for a moment. "Sir Davos is not nobly born, and he might have misunderstood me, and this was a mistake." John leant forwards, his eyes blazing with fury, and the Moxtons both went pale and stepped back. "Sir Davos Seaworth may be low-born, as you say, but he has been an exemplary commander of the city watch and is a vast improvement on his predecessor. And you will not sneer at him." The Moxtons directed almost identical looks of baffled terror at him, and it was then that Quill slipped into the room, looking grimly pleased with himself. As he approached him he passed over a small journal marked with a red ribbon. John took it with a frown and then opened the book to the page indicated. It was one of Baelish's books, and John looked up and directed a look of very real loathing at the Moxtons, who looked highly uneasy. "Lord Moxton, where in Essos did you travel to?" The man's eyes darted all over the room, but not in John's direction. "Volantis, Lord Arryn. The lie was very near to being a blatant one. Lord Moxton, I have here in my hand a book that was formerly the property of the late and entirely unlamented Peter Baelish." At the very mention of Baelish Lord Moxton went pale and stiffened, his right hand going for a moment to where his sword hilt should have been. "It seems," John said stonily, "that you had a poor choice of friends. Your business dealings with Baelish are laid out in this book. Names, dates, amounts. And your links to Slavers Bay. That's where you have been, isn't it?" The elder Moxton paused and then shook his head, whilst the younger man shot his father a look of pure terror. John looked at them darkly and then exchanged a glance with Seaworth, who nodded slightly and then made a small gesture with one hand that made some of his gold cloaks step surreptitiously closer. "Quill. My lord. Lord Moxton and his son are to be detained at once. In the black cells." Both Moxtons were seized at once in what looked like a grip of iron by the gold cloaks, before being marched off. John beckoned Sir Davos over. "Separate cells if you please, Sir Davos. I sense that the son will tell all before his father does." Seaworth nodded shortly, a small smile on his face, and then he strode off, barking orders as he went. John watched him go and then sighed. Damn it! Would they never get to the end of Baelish's corruption? He stood tiredly, dismissed the people around him and walked off down the corridor to one side, Quill an ever-attentive presence at his right hand and his guards from the veil behind him. When he emerged into the courtyard at the far end of the corridor he found Oberyn Martell practicing with his spear there against a straw target that had armor placed onto it. The man had a great deal of skill, the spear flashing in the sunlight, but he did have to wonder just what was on the edge of that blade. The Red Viper of Dawn was rumored to use poison, which seemed a bit much. He just wiped the edge of his blade against rotted meat once in a while, as his father had taught him. Which, in turn, made him think of Lysa, and his mood darkened for a long moment. "Most skillful, Prince Oberyn," he said after a particularly extravagant flourish of the spear. "You are very skilled with that." There's always more to learn," the Dornishman panted as he finished by jamming the spear in the face of the target. "You are well on this fine day." "Yes and no. Yes, it is indeed a fine day. But no, I do not like it when lords are fools and have dealings with slavers. Oberyn Martell laughed shortly. Who is it? Moxton. Lord Moxton. Crownlander lord, not as clever as he thinks he is, has a truly stupid and ugly son and heir, goes to Meereen a lot. I wonder why. He had links to Baelish. Martell pulled a face. Ah, Baelish. The arrogant fool whose appropriated holdings have been most profitable. He seems to have gotten very complacent at the end. Jon nodded. And then he pulled out the letter that had arrived in the morning from the north, via a fast ship from White Harbour. In your time in Essos, did you have any dealings with the Company of the Rose? The Dornishman raised an eyebrow. A little. They were the most boring and conservative of the sellsword companies. They never did anything that was too risky, too violent. I always thought that they were, well, a group of northern exiles who were caught between Westeros and Essos. Both and neither. Of course I have heard rumors now that they seem to have been waiting for something like this call. He held the letter out. From Lord Stark. He explains much about the Company of the Rose and their links to the Starks. Oberyn Martell took the letter with a frown and then started to read it at the proffered page. After a long moment of what looked like very rapid reading, based on the movement of his eyes, he stiffened a little and then seemed to reread certain parts, before turning to the next page. After a long moment he sank onto the nearest bench. Torrhen Stark seems to have been a man with a very long-term plan, he said eventually. A man who wanted the very best for the North. He looked down at the letter again. I always wondered about what made him bend the knee the way that he did. It seemed, not northern. Although now I am wondering what northern truly is. The blood of the first men seems to sing a great deal. Jon nodded. The next page should interest you. The Dornishman looked at him quizzically and then turned the page and read. When he looked up there was an odd look on his face. The Isle of Faces. Aye, for his ancestor to have gone there, that does explain a great deal. A peculiar place. 3 times I have tried to go there and 3 times I have been diverted. I will not say prevented, but certainly distracted away from the place. I wonder why now. The green men are said to be abroad again. I wish that I could talk to one. Jon nodded. Me as well. He shook his head. Well, now. The nobility of the North has grown thanks to the foresight of the last king in the North. I cannot believe that I have said those last words. The call. So much has changed because of it. I never thought that the Game of Thrones could be, well, suspended in this way, or most certainly changed beyond all recognition. I will be leaving for the North myself soon, Oberyn said with an upraised eyebrow. Heading for Winterfell. I have a source of my own in the North and I am hoping that I receive a report from that source soon. A troubled look crossed his face. I hope to meet that source as well. Dorne will need to mobilize to a plan. There was a long moment of troubled silence and then Jon sighed. The Vale too. The king will be sending more orders soon. Instructions for the harvest, instructions for mobilization. A plan to defend the wall. The wall. Oberyn Martell shivered a little. A wall of ice in the far north. It chills my blood just to think of it. Sending any Dornishman there will take some planning in terms of clothing. He laughed softly for a moment, before pausing when he saw Quill approaching. Ah, Quill. Are the Moxtons secure in their new quarters? They are, my lord. But I am here for another reason. There is a man here who wants access to the Red Keep's Godswood. He stared at Quill. The Godswood. Who wants access to that? Quill looked uneasy for a moment, as if he was not sure that he was going to be believed. He says he is from the Isle of Faces, my lord. And his attire. I think he is a green man. Oberyn Martell stood suddenly, before looking about. I wish that I had 1,000,000 dragons in coins. He looked about again, stared at the sky and then shrugged. Well, it was worth a try. And then he looked at Jon. Shall we meet this man? They walked up to the Godswood together, Oberyn Martell with a look on his face that spoke of excitement. As they approached the entrance, a tall man dressed in dark green clothes and a green cloak with an oddly shaped hood behind him stood up from the bench by the entrance. He had a grave expression on his face, and as they approached he bowed in an oddly archaic way, one hand over his heart and the other extended. "My lords," he rumbled in a deep voice. "I am Callan, son of Alin, of the Isle of Faces. And I beg admittance to this Godswood to tend to it and the weirwood heart tree." John frowned a little. "The heart tree is just an oak tree. No weirwood tree exists in the Godswood, none have ever grown there." The green man nodded in acknowledgement of his words, and then he stole a look at the main body of the red keep that for some reason made the hairs on the back of John's neck stand on end. After a moment he smiled slightly and then reached down and pulled out something that had been carefully wrapped in a bag, with something red poking out of the top of it. He then unwrapped the lower part to reveal a weirwood sapling. "This one will thrive here, you have my word on it." Somewhat bewildered, John paused and then nodded. "Very well, Callan, son of Alin. Enter." The green man nodded back before pulling up his hood to reveal a pair of horns, and it was at that moment that the hairs on the back of his neck behaved in such a way that he shivered with, what? Fear. Dread. Anticipation. What? He followed the green-clad man into the Godswood and then watched as he looked about the place, sniffed the air, pulled up a small amount of grass and inspected it carefully, and then pulled out a small spade and dug an equally small hole in the ground, into which he almost reverently pressed the base of the weirwood sapling. "It will do well here," the green man said with an odd note of satisfaction that seemed to reverberate a little in the grove. "It will thrive." "You are sure of that?" Oberyn Martell asked, an odd, almost assessing, look on his face. The green man stood and placed a hand on the leaves as if to reassure them. "Oh," he said with a slight smile, "I am certain of that." And when he removed his hand the tree seemed to have surged upwards at least a foot in height. "Most certain." Ned. Riding south was difficult at first. He missed Cat and the children, of course. He was horribly aware of the fact that he was riding away from running the North in the middle of one of the greatest crises in its history, certainly since the last long night, but there was something else. He felt as if he was needed at the wall, but he was riding away from it. Was it the Fist of Winter? Was it some aspect of being the Stark in Winterfell? Was it Winterfell itself? He was still frustrated by the lack of information that was out there, by all the unanswered questions that he had. If only Father had been able to talk him through the family history. If only Father had lived. Or Brandon. And if only the other half of that book had survived, the old half-burnt one. Torjern Sheristone and what he had known had been on his mind much of late, and he had talked to Daisy about what might be in the library, or the solar, of Sheristone. Was there a hidden room there as well, as there had been in Winterfell and the Dread Fort? But then, as he rode south, something else started to tickle down his backbone, the feeling that he was going in the right direction, that he was needed somewhere to the south. It was a strange, confusing feeling, something that was right there at the edge of his senses. At least he was going south in company. There had been some discussion about how Stannis Baratheon and the others were going to get to Harlaw. There were two options. One was to go to Torrens Square and then use the ships there to do down the river and then out to the Iron Island. The problem with that was the majority of ships there right now belonged to Tywin Lannister, and in the words of Asher Greyjoy, Westerlanders are a bunch of useless fucking lubbers who can't build decent ships to save their lives. Stannis had pointed out that those self-same Westerlanders had been amongst those who had taken Pike, which had earned him a glower from the Greyjoy girl. The second option was to get a ship from Barrowton. It was a shorter trip downriver, it gave Ned more time with Stannis to discuss what needed to be done and to make decisions. Ravens flew ahead, riders came from behind, and the hand of the King and the Lord of the North were kept up to date with what was going on. They stayed at Castle Sewin the first night after a hard ride south. Old Major Sewin had greeted them with all due respect and then quietly explained that he had been there when that old rascal Tywin Lannister had seen his first White's head. Ned had smiled a little and shaken his head at the tale, before listening to Lord Sewin's careful briefing on what House Sewin was doing to answer the call. The day after that they had continued south, with Frostfyre at his side from wherever in the woods she had been the previous night. Judging by his dreams, which had been about a chase involving a deer, he knew that she had been hunting, and he had the persistent feeling of sated hunger at the other end of his senses. Gods, life could be most odd at times. South they rode, not as hard as the ride south from Castle Black, but hard enough. The Ironborn contingent were not complaining. they dare not show weakness in the face of so many men of the north, but they were trying to pretend that they weren't saddle sore and were surreptitiously asking about some of the liniment that Daisy had made for the party. He was proud of the way that John and Theon were holding themselves in their saddles. Theon was not rubbing his skill at riding in the nose of his sister and her men, whilst John was behaving like the Stark he was now, organizing, encouraging, leading. Lionel would have been so proud of him. South they rode, and as they went he could see with his own eyes how the north was preparing for the coming war. Fields of oats and barley being harvested as men and women stared at the ground of the fields currently covered in sheep or cattle dung and talked of ploughing and sowing on their next, to let the soil recover on the other fields. Northmen were not idiots when it came to farming. The idiots had starved to death in previous centuries after not making the most of their fields. And then there was the other thing, which made him feel that odd combination of bewilderment and pride at the foresight of his distant ancestor. On 3 occasions he laid eyes on what had once been slowly crumbling ruins, the remains of castles and strong points that had been abandoned decades or centuries ago but which were now being rebuilt, repaired, made strong again. The Company of the Rose had strengthened the north in so very many ways. Lords of all kinds were spending hoarded coin, and it was starting to show, in the hustle and bustle along the roads. Day after day, night after night, staying at castles and holdfasts and at inns. They passed the road to Torrens Square, then kept riding south, dealing with ravens and riders all the time. And they spent one night at Castle Coffeen. A small house, minor lordlings, but old Domeric Coffeen had been a friend of his father and had sent him not a few letters with words of wisdom over the years. Bran Coffeen had been the man at the main courtyard to offer bread and salt, however, the oldest son of Domeric. The large red-headed man had seen Ned's flickered eyebrow and grinned at him afterwards as everyone was dismounting. "Father's all right, Ned. He just strained his leg after riding too much and running around like an old fool. He's in his solar, complaining about the Maestas' instructions. He'd like you to meet him there." Sure enough, an extremely grumpy and impatient Domeric Coffeen had been waiting in his solar, a crutch by his chair and a certain look in his eye. "Lord Stark," he said with a seated bow. "Your pardon, but I am incapacitated and cannot greet you properly." "'Tis no matter, Lord Coffeen," Ned answered with a smile that turned a little sly. "Bran said you'd been running around like an old fool." The older man turned a little pink. What was her name?" The older man turned a little pinker. Alisan." He pretended to think about this, not that the other man bought that for a heartbeat. "The same Alisan as before, the widow of that merchant." "Oh, stop that, Ned." "Yes. You should marry her. At my age." He stopped for a moment and then just looked at the old fool. "A chance at being happy is better than no chance at all." The old man grumbled and shifted in his chair a bit, but he could tell that he'd planted a seed in his mind. "Word on the road is that you're off south to Barrowton." He sighed. Just between the two of us, there's trouble there." "I know," Lord Coffeen said almost sharply. "Word's spreading. Fog on the barrows there. Some say it's the spirits of the dead, awoken by the call. Some say it's ghosts of the original first men, calling for vengeance against the Andals. Whatever the truth of it, Ned, it's trouble. And Barbary Bloody Dustin is losing control of the situation, or that's what the latest word is. She's not listening to anyone, especially the Dustins that came from Essos. But then she always was a proud idiot. Damn it. He'd sent the Dustins south ahead of them days ago in the hope that they could bring back intelligence on just what was wrong, but it looked like Barbary was being her usual stubborn self. He'd had a nagging feeling that something was wrong for a day or two now, a strange scratch behind his eyeballs that had been growing with every mile south that they rode, and he'd wondered why the Dustins had sent no word back. "How much trouble?" "Enough that I was on the point of sending a raven to you when word came that you were passing my way anyway. The fog's not natural, Ned. And there's small folk around there that are starting to panic a bit. Here, have some ale. You look peaky." He was entitled to look bloody peaky, and he sighed as he quaffed his ale and then brooded a little in companionable silence. He had a bad feeling about this. Robert. He really couldn't put it off any longer. He was leaving for the wall in the morning. They should have left that morning, but some ravens had come in from King's Landing about such a wide range of things that he'd put their departure off a day. They'd leave in the morning, at dawn. In the meantime he was drifting about Winterfell, scowling at things and wondering how far south Ned had gotten so far. His old friend rode bloody hard. He'd done his exercises. He'd need to find a log or 10 on the road to the wall, as it wouldn't make sense to burden the supply horses with the one he'd been using, and he'd approved the latest game pie that the cooks had brought him. The head cook, a large woman who baked amazing pies, had announced that she was going to call it the Stag King's Triple Game Pie, as it used venison, boar and rabbit, after him. It was delicious and he'd ordered 3 of them for the road. He'd have to add an orbit or 2 of whatever exercise yard he was in on the road to burn the pies off. He was bloody wool gathering again, but then he was saved from further procrastination by the sight of 3 small forms running towards the crypts yet again. He sighed and then quickened his stride. Edric. The terrible threesome skidded to a halt, collectively visibly considered if they should make a bolt for it in the other direction, and then caught sight of Sir Preston Greenfield, who was smothering a grin, and subsided to a sullen slouch. It was fascinating to see how close those 3 were. And it made him smile sadly when he remembered his early years in the Vale. But then he caught himself and smiled at them. Right then, where are you 3 off to in such a hurry? The terrible threesome directed what they probably thought was entirely surreptitious side looks at each other, but which were blatantly obvious to him. He answered for them, the crypts to look for Vermux's eggs. The 3 boys froze in place, their eyes very wide, and he dared not look at Greenfield, who he suspected was really fighting that grin. He rubbed his chin and then went down onto one knee so that he was level with them. Lads, how big were the dragons? Edric and the others stared at him, and then they all stood on tiptoe and threw their arms up as far as they could reach. He raised his eyebrows for a moment and tried to ignore Greenfield, who had a sudden coughing fit that sounded awfully like suppressed laughter. They were a bit bigger than that, lads. A lot bigger, in fact. The dragon skulls that are in the lower levels of the Red Keep, well, some of the skulls alone are big enough for a man my size to walk through. Now, tell me. Could something that big get into the crypts through a door that size? There was a long moment of silence, and then the 3 boys visibly sagged with disappointment. He sighed a little. But that doesn't mean that Vermux didn't lay eggs somewhere else. Perhaps you could consult the histories. With Maester Lewin's help, of course. The terrible threesome perked up a little, but then seemed to be caught between cautious excitement about a new Vermux theory and vague horror at studying. As they nodded slowly, he smiled. Now I need Edric to come with me for a bit. I need to talk to him and his half-brother and sister. The other 2 nodded and briskly trudged off, leaving a rather puzzled Edric. Now you're not in any trouble. But we need to talk to Maya and Gendry. Maya was, of course, with the horses, and she followed them to the forge where, of course, Gendry was working. Or rather not working, just sitting and staring at 2 pieces of armor, once with a glowing rune on it and the other without. The same rune, inscribed the same way, same dimensions, but one glows and the other doesn't. Why? Gendry was staring hard and so engrossed that he didn't know that they were there until he cleared his throat, making Gendry look up, startled. Your Grace, I mean Father, I mean Your Grace. Gods, the lad looked rattled again. He raised a hand and then gestured at the others to sit down. And it was at that point that his nerve, or at least his voice, failed him. He paced about the forge for a long moment, glaring at various things. His 3 children, the true children, sat there and stared at him with some bewilderment. He looked at them, at their black hair and blue eyes, and then he steeled himself and sat down opposite them. Right. I leave for the wall tomorrow. I wanted to have this conversation with you all this morning, but too much had to be done and I had to put it off. They were still staring at him and he sighed. Right. I am off to the wall, as I said. And there is something that I need to tell you all. Ravens flew this morning, ravens to King's Landing. You are all legitimized now. There was a moment of utter silence, and then the 3 exchanged baffled looks with each other, although it was Edric who started to look the most stunned. Father, Edric muttered, staring at him. Are you saying that we are? He nodded. You are all Baratheons. I have decreed it. None of you are now bastards, you are all my children. But he held up a finger. The issue of who is to be my heir is not something that concerns you. For the time being at least, my heir is your Uncle Stannis. He looked at them all and then sighed. Life can be brutal at times and I might not come back from the wall. This might be the last time we all meet. And then again it might not. But I had to tell you all that as of this moment, well, as of this morning you are all Baratheons. House Baratheon needs you. The gods alone know how small it is at the moment. But at the very least it now has you lot. There was a long moment of utter silence and then Maya, with tears in her eyes, stood and then ran into his arms. Edric followed her, whilst Gendry stood, looked deeply uncertain and then finally took his proffered hand, with a look of stunned bewilderment. He smiled. Family. Family was all. Sandor. He sat there in Great Hall and stared into his mug of ale. As all the gods were his witness, he had absolutely no idea what to do with his life next. Not the faintest fucking clue. His face was healed. For the first time since he had been a child he wasn't in constant pain. He could eat and drink without needing to tilt his head to one side to stop things dribbling out of the hole in his cheek. He was whole again. Because of gods that he had never really believed in, not truly. But now a man out of legend had healed him. And if he hadn't really known what to do with his life much before, after the little shit's disgrace, he really didn't know now. All his adult life he'd wanted to take his vengeance on the monster, the walking thing that was supposed to be his brother. And now? Oh, his hate was still there, it would never leave him, it was a part of him. But he had the oddest feeling that, well, somehow he couldn't put his finger on it. It was like he was on a knife edge of something he had no fucking words for. Tywin fucking Lannister had asked him again if he was willing to go to the wall and protect his grandson. Well, his double grandson, which had to be eating up the old bastard inside. He'd told him no, that there was no way he was riding north to catch up with Mormont and the little shit. Oh, he'd treasure the moment that he'd seen Joffrey Bloody Hill, pale, gaunt even, a huddled figure in huge black furs, leave Winterfell and ride off north. The little shit had been a shadow of his normal arrogant self. Maybe Mormont would beat him into some kind of shape. Was that even possible? Did he care? No, he really did not. But what was out there, north of the wall? The Whiteheads spoke of something dark and terrible that made him shiver with something that felt odd. Fear. Terror. What was it? He couldn't put his finger on it. He shuddered and then drained his mug of ale, before sighing and then wiping his mouth. What was he to do? Another. He looked up to see a serving girl standing there. Well, a serving woman. He'd seen her before, fluttering about like a pigeon about him, half scared and half attracted by him. Beth, her name was. Some might call her plain, but she had an ass like a peach and tits that caught his eye. But, his face had repulsed her. Until now, it seemed, which provoked some odd feelings inside him. Resentment that it wasn't until now that she seemed to like him. Well, perhaps he should get used to that. He smiled a little at her and watched her blush a little. Another, please. The ale from the jug she was carrying gurgled into his mug and then she looked to one side, went as pale as a ghost and scurried away from the table. He looked in the direction that she had been looking at and went so very still. His brother, the monster himself, was standing there and staring at him. He glared at the man, making it very clear that he wanted him to fuck off and die in some squalid part of the world somewhere. But the monster did not take the hint. Instead he just stood there and stared at him, as if he had no idea what he was. Beth returned quickly with the fresh ale, keeping well away from the monster and handing the mug over quickly before all but fleeing again. Sandor kept glaring at the monster and the monster just stood there and stared at him. After a long moment he finally sat down on a wooden stool that protested with a wooden groan. Sandor quaffed his ale and then checked that the nearest brazier was a long way off. He wouldn't put it past his brother if he tried to burn him again in order to make sense of the world again, or whatever passed for such thoughts in the huge man's head. There was something wrong with the monster's eyes. They were flickering about his face and odd little frowns kept coming and going. He looked as if he was trying to say something, but failing utterly. What? Sandor growled at last, do you want? Say what you want to say and then fuck right off again. Yes, my face is healed. Yes, the old gods did it. They repaired what you fucking did to me. Now bugger off. But still the huge figure in front of him sat there, his eyes still flickering over his face. And eventually he finally said something. Just one word. Dreams. What? Dreams. The monster said the word as if he was being dragged out of him. Terrible dreams. And something's not right. Voices. His face worked slightly for a moment and then went still. Sander stared at him. The monster was not acting as he normally did. And the eyes, there was something about the eyes that disturbed him, but he couldn't put his finger in why. Eventually he shrugged. Don't eat cheese before you sleep. He paused. Now fuck off. And then he quaffed his ale some more. The monster sat there and then stood suddenly, with an abruptness that made Sander almost pause in his quaffing. He was ready for whatever shit the monster was about to try. But instead Gregor Clegane just stood there, a strange look on his face. And then, just before he turned and walked away, he said something in an odd, bone-dry almost old voice. Something dark is coming. He eyed the retreating back of the monster and despite himself shivered a little. There had been something about his voice that, again, he couldn't put his finger on it. And then Beth came over with another ale and oh yes, there was something in the upturn of her lips and the swing of her hips that spoke volumes. Samuel. Archmaester Ibros was not a man who could ever look gaunt. However, as he read the report that Sam had written so very carefully after finishing his research and then sleeping for 8 hours, there was a ghost of gauntness about his face. The old Archmaester finished reading and put the report down, before staring bleakly across the table at some undefinable place on the wall over Sam's head. I talked to Peristan about your report. Marwyn too. Both endorsed it in the highest possible terms. You should be very proud of this, Lord Samwell. You really do have the making of a very fine maester. I know, the very thought of that would make your father have an apoplexy, but my comment still stands. Sam nodded and smiled slightly for a moment, before the smile fled. Yes, he was proud of what he had written. The problem was that what he had written had terrified him. Archmaester, we need to tell Lord Tyrell. It's just that, what we have to tell him is, well, somewhat horrifying. We have to tell Lords Tyrell and Hightower that there's a dying god in the cellar of the Hightower itself, Ladybros sighed. Come on, let's get this done. They crossed to the Hightower on one of the Citadel's boats, rowed by servants who looked nervously over their shoulders at the Hightower until the man at the tiller roared at them to keep their minds on the stroke and not clash their fucking oars like a mob of lubbers. He didn't look at the Archmaester, he could almost sense the glower on the man's face. The general population knew that there was something to worry about at the base of the Hightower. If they knew the truth. He shook himself slightly, unwilling to appear to be too apprehensive and then hoping that the men were not watching him. They were not, they were concentrating on their stroke, thanks to the furiously glowering man at the tiller. As it happened, Lord Tyrell was in his grandfather's office at the very top of the Hightower and he was surprised that it was the Archmaester who was huffing and puffing more than he was when they got there. He had to admit that he was a little lighter on his feet than he had been before. It might have been all that dashing around in the Citadel and the fact that he'd been forgetting to eat every now and then. When they were admitted, they found Lord Tyrell sitting at the desk and Lord Hightower at the window, glowering at the horizon. There was a map on the desk, a map of the Reach. Lord Samwell, Archmaester Ibros. Lord Tyrell acknowledged them as they sat in front of him. How can I help you? Archmaester Ibros harumphed a little, directed a beetling brow in his direction and then sighed. Lord Samwell here has translated the runes around the gate. The words were short and simple, but they made Lord Tyrell sit up straight in his chair and Lord Hightower spin on his heel and stare straight at him, his eyebrows raised. How? That one word was directed by Lord Tyrell at himself and he nodded at his liege lord. The runes were written by the children of the forest, my lord. They built the gate, and the lowest course of the Hightower. Now, we did not know their language. But they were allied to the First Men and they taught the First Men how to write in runes. There are a number of places where they made agreements and alliances, or something similar, and wrote those agreements down in runes carved in rock in their separate languages, but with the same words. I translated the words the First Men used and compared them to the other carvings and, well, worked out the language of the children of the forest. There was a slight silence that was broken by the Archmaester. My lords, what Lord Samwell has done, very carefully and diligently but above all accurately, is an extraordinary piece of work that if he had been a maester would have earned a great deal of acclaim. As it is, I have been asked by the other archmaesters of the citadel to give Lord Samwell this. And with that he handed Sam a bronze ring, one that might have been a part of a maester's chain. He flushed a little and then looked at the two lords, who were still staring at him. My lords, the runes were very plain. The drowned god is trying to get through the gate. Lord Hightower turned as white as a sheet, whilst Lord Tyrell sighed heavily and leant back in his chair. Then my father's last words were the truth. Do the runes on the gate say why he's there? Sam leant forward a little, after seeing the tired nod from the archmaester. Some of the terms used by the children are archaic, so the meaning is unclear in places, but the gist of it that the drowned god was one of the old gods who was sent mad by the war against the power that made the others. Which is itself worrying, as if something made the others then that's another thing beyond the wall that the call needs us to deal with. Catching the meaning of the harem from the archmaester and correctly translating it as meaning get on with it, he continued. Apparently the old gods worked through the children of the forest to create the gate as a portal into death, or something like that anyway, and somehow got the drowned god to manifest himself so that he could be thrust through it. But it seems that somehow he, well, the best analogy I have for it is that he's stuck just on the doorstep on the other side of the gate, unwilling to pass on but not strong enough to pass back. And he's been there for thousands of years. So if he was even just a bit mad before, he's stark raving bonkers by now. Oh, and the runes say one last thing. Apparently he had worshippers in the First Men, those that he spoke to personally. They lost track of where he was, but realized that he's sort of still there. Apparently, and then he lost the ability to say the next words. Fortunately the archmaester spotted this and continued on his behalf. Apparently what the runes described as the dark magic priests of the drowned god, which might refer to necromancers, a particularly dark form of blood magic, realized that their god was weakening and have been trying to strengthen him by the means of certain rituals that involve blood and violence. He looked bleakly at them all. I believe that that was the earliest reference to the old way and the iron price. The believers of the drowned god seem to have relocated themselves to the sea and became what we now know today as the Ironborn. A long silence settled over the room, crushing many of Sam's hopes for a quiet life any time soon. It was finally broken by Lord Tyrell, who looked at his grandfather. Well, that might explain the Ironborn obsession with Old Town, grandfather? Lord Hightower nodded slowly. It might. They don't know where their mad creature of a god was effectively imprisoned, but something keeps dragging them here. He looked back at Sam. Did the children hand the gate over to the First Men then? They did, he said with a nod. And it seems that Bran the Builder, well, built on their work. But that's all that the runes say, apart from a strange reference that might refer to the Starks. It said that the one who speaks straight and who bears the hammer from the sky will be the one to call upon should the drowned god ever try and get back into this world. Lord Tyrell looked at him and then ran his hand over his face. Lord Stark is on his way now. Which is a good thing. Lord Samwell, Archmaester, what I have to say now does not go beyond this room. Do you both understand me? A bit bewildered he nodded. After also receiving Archmaester Ebrost's nod, the Lord of the Reach stood and walked to the nearest window, his hands clasped behind his back. After a long moment he turned to them. My father's last words were also that the thing behind the gate, the drowned god as we now know, also brought something else apart from fear. Blight. And, blight has been reported. In certain orchards near Old Town the fruit has started to shrivel on the branches. Grapes too. And wheat and barley. It is not widespread, it's just a few places so far, but it's out there. He fell silent. It was Lord Hightower who said the next words, the words that sent his heart into his boots, and it's slowly spreading. Tyrion. The sun was shining, he was freshly bathed in the excellent hot water bath that their rooms had. Breakfast was a happy memory, certain bits of him ached after some very pleasurable activities and he walking about a rather beautiful bit of Winterfell, next to the Godswood. He had some very mixed feelings at the moment. On one hand he was happier than he had ever been in his life, from a purely selfish standpoint. He was married to a beautiful woman who was clever and kind and funny and above all extremely inquisitive about the kind of pleasure that could be had once naked and intertwined with him. Daisy had read a lot of very interesting books about the art of lovemaking, and she had a very open mind, not to mention an active imagination. They were both desperate to make the other happy. There were times when he felt as if his head was going to burst from pleasure. Oh, and he was also the heir to Casterly Rock, and father was treating him as if he wasn't made from pond scum but possibly actually worthy of a little respect. In addition, Jaime was alive, having been virtually rescued from execution, and Cersei was in disgrace. On the other hand, he was also getting paranoid. The last time he'd been this happy had been, well, Tisha. And that shining moment of happiness had been shattered by his father. Yes, father approved of this marriage of his. But, well, what could the but be? What could possibly happen? He paused in his leisurely meander. A guard in Lannister red was approaching, before coming to a halt and bowing his head. "Lord Tyrion, your Lord Father requests your presence in his study." He could almost hear the capital letters in the words, and it was not his study, it was a room that Ned Stark had let him have. But he suppressed a sigh and walked off behind the guard. He found his father writing at the desk he was using, the map of Westeros in front of him. As he entered, father looked at him and then nodded at the guard. "Leave us." The red-cloaked man bowed his head and left. Father leant back in his chair and looked at him. "I leave for the wall tomorrow, due to various delays. And there are things we must discuss that I have put off." "Sit." He sat at once, eyeing father carefully. There was a certain something in his voice. "I have sent off various messages to various places, on various topics. Casterly Rock will soon know that you are my heir, acknowledged as such by the king himself." He nodded at father's words and then wondered what Aunt Jenna would say. Her whoop of pride would probably make the rock shake. "Kevan will ride with me, so that we can send the latest instructions to the Westerlands, and then he and Geryon, along with their sons, will ride to the Shadow Tower and then take ship for Lannisport. Apparently Geryon wants his son to see the family home." And then father huffed a little. "Then there is the issue of her." He said that last word in tones of the blackest fury and contempt, which was quite impressive given that it had just 3 letters. "Ah. Cersei. I have written to Jon Arryn about a suitable location for her exile. We cannot send her to any island off the coast of the Westerlands, for the one thing she knows too many people there, and then there is the danger posed by the Ironborn. Whilst her being taken off to be a salt wife might have a measure of irony, given her sluttish whims, she is still a Lannister." Tyrion nodded carefully, blinking slightly at the black and terrible look that had crossed his father's face during that slight pause in his words. Father was still father. Crossing him was inadvisable. Instead we must look to the east coast of Westeros. Which is why I wrote to Jon Arryn. There are certain islands off the coast of the Vale that might suffice. When a message arrives to say that she can be sent there, agree to it at once. I want her exiled, isolated and out of my life. Out of my misery, I might say. It will be up to you to tell her of her exile. I dare not visit her. The last time I talked with her I battled against the desire to slit her throat. Now that I have fully thought about the implications of her actions," and with those last words father looked, well, old for an instant, before he looked up. "You will have to make sure that she is kept locked away after I am dead. And as I am going to see what the war at the wall will be like, we must take every precaution as to the line of succession. I might not come back from the wall. You need to be ready." It was a sobering moment. "I will do my best, father. I know what the wall is like and what the threat there is also like. Father, be careful on the wall. The Night's Watch are an eclectic group and fell very far over the past century, but the volunteers that have flocked there since the call went out have raised them back up again, and they know what is out there." Father's hard emerald green eyes assessed him for an instant, and then he received the briefest of acknowledging nods. And then the eyes softened just a tad. "I saw your wife this morning. She seemed happy." He tried to control his face, but a bit of a happy grin played about his expression for an instant. "I hope so." "Good. Keep her happy, otherwise many of the lords of the north will be very unhappy with you, especially Ned Stark. And Lord Bolton. Get her with child, in other words." Father sighed a little and then leant back. "Is there any word yet from Surestone?" He nodded. "Yes. The Maester there has reopened everything and the things that Bootle had stolen have been returned there safely. Sherestone is being restored to what it was. We will visit it in a month or so. Father nodded. And the library there? He blinked. Intact, from what the Maester wrote. Good. Father stood and then looked at him gravely. Torbjörn Sherestone put a great deal into his book about the first men. I do wonder though what he left out because it was secret. Do your best to find out, for all our sakes. And then father nodded at the door in dismissal. Well now, he thought as he left the room, talking to Circe about her exile might require armor. Sarala. She looked down at the little scroll in her hand and thanked the gods for small mercies. But then she pulled a face. Well, so she was headed to Castle Black again. At least this time she was traveling north knowing what were the right things to wear. She had almost died the last time. Now she knew better. Her fingernails clattered softly on the tabletop and then she nodded and stood. Well, it wouldn't take her long to get her things together. But first she had to tell a few people. She found Lady Stark talking quietly to the Maester in one of the courtyards, not too far from the forge, which was huffing and puffing in a way that meant that someone was in there. As she waited for the Lady of Winterfell to finish talking to the old man she observed them carefully, storing the information in her mind the way that father had taught her. Lady Stark was an interesting one. Clever but with limitations. Inflexible, but apparently learning to bend a little. She had oh so many internal walls, some with holes in them, others thicker than the walls of Winterfell. Oh, and she had her fair share of prejudices. As the Maester bowed and hurried off, Lady Stark nodded at her and she walked up. She knew that Lady Stark was having trouble classifying her. She was a bastard, which many people outside Dorne found a threat, but she was also the daughter of one of the great lords of Westeros, who just happened to be the Red Viper of Dorne. Oh, and she had fought side by side with her beloved eldest son against rogue wildlings and whites and others. Yes, no wonder she was having trouble working out what Sarala was. Lady Stark, I have received a raven from King's Landing, from my father, Prince Oberyn Martell. He is sailing from there with the first consignments of wildfire, bound for Eastwatch by the sea. I am therefore riding with the King's party tomorrow for Castle Black and after that along the wall for my father's destination. I thought that I should inform you of my imminent departure. Thank you, Sarala, Lady Stark said with a small smile. I shall inform the steward who will ride with his grace. The smile vanished. Your father sails on a ship with wildfire in it. She nodded, letting the unease that she was feeling cross her face. He wrote that it is a calculated risk and that measures have been taken to weaken the substance. But yes, it is still a risk. He also says that the king has been informed. She could only imagine what Robert Baratheon's language might have been like. Probably something on the lines of, "The balls on that man." Lady Stark shivered a little and she understood why. The wildfire would make anyone shiver. But father knew that. Knew the risks. She trusted father to know the risks. After all, he wasn't crazy. Well, impulsive, yes. Crazy, no. I would like to thank you, Lady Stark, for your hospitality. I have greatly enjoyed my time in Winterfell. Which was true, and she had much to report to father. She also felt that she understood the North far better now. Yes, parts of it were a frozen hellhole, but the people of the North were interesting. She bowed to Lady Stark, muttered further pleasantries and moved away at her acknowledgement. Her path took her past the forge, where she saw the newly legitimized Gendry Baratheon stripped to the waist and pounding on what looked like the makings of a halberd. He did not look in a good mood. So, she leant on the doorpost, enjoyed the view of the half-naked man and noted the fact that Alicent Lannister was off to one side, at the far end of the courtyard. He looked as if he had just arrived and was watching her cautiously. How does it feel? Not being a bastard anymore, I mean. Gendry eyed her as if he did not quite know what to make of her. After a moment he shrugged. Doesn't feel a bit different. There's still things to forge. There's never a lack of things to make. Having a different last name doesn't change that, does it? She tilted her head. You are the newly legitimized son of the king. You don't have to be here. He eyed her as if she was raving mad. Where else would I be? Anywhere you like. He looked confused for a moment and then he shook his head. This is what I know. She looked at him, amused. You'll need to know more. Why? You might be king one day. Gendry stared at her and then laughed. Me? King? Give over. Edric will be king before me. He's noble born. And you're older than him. So? Your father is going to war. Wars are nasty unpredictable things. You need to widen your horizons, Gendry Baratheon. The lad scoffed a bit. I need my horizons widened enough to work out how to make those fucking things work. He gestured at a pair of braces, one with glowing runes and one with runes that didn't glow at all. I can't make runes that glow. She walked over to the braces and picked them both up. Then you need to think differently. Widen your damn horizons. You are thinking like a modern blacksmith. He eyed her as if she was mad again. I am. So think like a blacksmith of the first men. She put the braces back and strode out of the forge. As she did she noted that Illyrian Lannister was approaching. I hear you are riding with us, the son of Geryon Lannister muttered. As far as Castle Black at least. She nodded, uneasy with the feelings that were coursing through her. They would be riding together again. I will then ride to Eastwatch by the sea, to meet my father. He nodded, forehead apparently creased in thought. Tell him to be careful with the wildfire. Oh, and that he shouldn't make fun of Umbers. Or those who might be part giant. She stared at him as the infuriating bloody man smiled enigmatically at her and then walked off. Well, boy. Man boy. Lad. Why did he always leave her in such a state of bafflement? Ned. With every mile that they rode south the nagging feeling that something was very wrong somewhere got stronger, like an itch that he could not scratch. He put it down to irritation at first at being made to do this journey, but as they passed further down the road and the itch got worse he had to admit that this was something more. It was also leading to some very mixed feelings. He was proud of what he was seeing as they rode south. The north was responding magnificently to the call. He'd never seen so many fields under the plough or being sown, or being reaped or just standing there, filled with wind-stroked barley or wheat. There were windmills, both old and new, their sails rotating in the wind, the millstones within grinding out flour. The windmills seemed to fascinate young Grit, who used to turn and watch them as they passed them. Sometimes she'd watch so hard that she'd almost ride into trees, before her horse swerved, startling her. He had Jon keep an eye on her, aware that things between those two were, peculiar might be the word to use. They were dancing a very pretty gavotte around each other and he had a feeling that the dance might end up at a fascinating place, given their respective origins. He'd long agonized over Jon's future. He had to keep him safe, that was the most important thing. He had made a promise to Lyanna to keep him safe, and also sworn to Robert that he'd keep Jon somewhere in the north. And in terms of marriage, well, now that Jon was a Stark there were offers from various houses, with more probably coming. Would marriage to one of them make him happier than he might be with Ygritte? A wilderling. The red-headed girl was a set of contradictions, impulsive, amusing, perceptive and utterly ignorant about a lot of things south of the wall. She was also learning by leaps and bounds, absorbing information about everything around her. Oh, and she had a mouth like a fishwife when provoked. So he would let the gavotte proceed. Robert had had a quiet word with him as well about it, as the girl amused him, and as he had also pointed out, the thought of Aerys Targaryen's grandson marrying a wilderling was something that really amused him and would also make the Mad King's shade scream in pure rage. It was something to think about as they kept riding south. Something to keep his mind off the roiling sense of unease that was starting to grip him as they rode across the Barrowlands. The road was being worked on in various places, as it was seeing a great deal of traffic, mostly heading northeast for the King's Road. Most knew who he was by the banners flown by the Outriders, and there were the occasional cheers from men and women, but for the most part he was struck by the intensity he saw. People were worried and working hard, either in the fields or on the roads. Which made him wonder something. Was the call affecting some people even now, or was this down to what was happening at Barrowtown? A day away from Barrowtown they encountered another half-ruined castle, one that was being repaired by a minor Barrowland house. And it was there that they found Brandon Dustin and his sons, all waiting for him with grim faces as the sun started to set. As the rest of the party dismounted and started to prepare a meal, the former member of the Company of the Rose looked at Ned and Stannis and then gestured at a door to one side in part of a repaired section. "Lord Stark, Lord Baratheon, a word if you please." They passed through the door and into a small storeroom that seemed to contain building supplies, where they turned to look at Lord Brandon Dustin, whose face was still grim. "Lady Dustin barely spoke 10 words to me, my lords," he said quietly. "She wouldn't even look at me after a while. I didn't know what to do or say, but she somehow found me at fault, Lord Stark, my Lord Hand. I started to ask questions about the fog and Barrowtown and above all the books that Lord Willam Dustin, my cousin, had, but after a while she claimed that I had come to steal Barrowtown from her and told me to leave." He made a frustrated gesture with his hands. "I did not want to go, but she did not give me a chance to explain that I do not want Barrowtown, that I was there to help with the fog, but she looked like a woman at her wit's end, my lords. She made no sense." Ned sighed and ran a hand over his chin. Damn it. He'd had a nagging feeling that something like this might happen. And the fog. Brandon Dustin paused, sighed and then ran a hand through his hair. "It's not natural, Lord Stark. Not natural at all. It was confined to the Barrows itself, by Barrowtown. But, well, it's spreading. And people are talking about it. There's a lot of very nervous people in Barrowtown at the moment, my lords, and some of them are even talking about leaving the area if the fog spreads any further. This was bad. Very bad." Ned swapped a troubled look with Stannis. "How far has it spread already?" "Beyond the Barrows, my lords. Not into the fields nearby or the town itself, but I was told that it's creeping closer. And it's odd. As odd as they said it was. Wind won't touch it." And he fell silent, with words left unsaid. "And, my lord." Brandon stood straight and thrust his chin out a little. "My lords, when I stood not far from it I heard voices. Men and women speaking in the language of the first men. I thought I was imagining it at first, so faint was it, but I heard it, I know that I did. My sons heard it too, but fainter." Ned stiffened a little. "Could you hear what the voices were saying?" He was answered with a reluctant tilt of the head. "Sometimes. I heard commands to muster. I think I heard the words Stark and the Fist. And I think I heard Oathstone, if I have the word right in the old tongue." "Oathstone?" Ned muttered. "What do you know of that?" The former member of the Company of the Rose looked slightly uncomfortable. "I do not know exactly what it is, but when every Dustin comes of age they are told that they have to protect and maintain the Oathstone. It's said to be by the barrow of the first king of the first men, but I don't know anything more than that, my lords. There should be more information in Barrowtown, but," he spread his hands. "Lady Dustin commanded us to leave. She did not forbid me from returning, but the words were close to being said. Barbary bloody Dustin. Was she born to plague him? He had no wish to strip her lands from her, he had given his word at Castle Black, but if she continued to act like a fool then he might have no choice than to at the very least name Brandon Dustin or his sons as her heir, as she had no heir herself of Dustin blood. And that was important. Domeric could not inherit the title of Lord Dustin, even though he was her nephew. And that was probably it. Well now, Ned said grimly, we will ride into Barrowtown tomorrow and have words with Lady Dustin. I have to tell you both now that Lord Willam Dustin died fighting at my side during the rebellion and Lady Dustin still blames me for that. It cannot be helped. However, this matter of the fog must be divined correctly and dealt with no matter what Lady Dustin might want. And you, Lord Brandon, will ride with us. Your sons too. The other 2 men nodded shortly. And now, my lords, let us eat and go to respective beds. They did just as he said. Dinner that night was venison that had been hanging at the castle. He ordered that it be replaced with a haunch that they had brought with them, and there was some good cheer as they ate and drank. But his thoughts kept turning to Barrowtown and the fog, and he could tell that the others were also thinking the same thing. Nevertheless, he watched with a smile as Ygritte and Jon sparred over what was better, venison from north of the wall or south of it, and he had to say that Jon just about won it, barely. He did not sleep well that night. He woke several times with a feeling of oppression, almost terror, as if someone had walked over his grave. The dreams he could recall were half-remembered fragments, jagged memories of moments of pain and regret, and yet somehow determination and hope as well. As he joined the others in the morning to break their fasts, he smiled a little as he looked at the freshly baked bread rolls that someone had been able to bake. They were still warm and the butter that he spread on them melted a little. It was delicious, along with the smoked ham that was shared out, and he left the castle with a full belly and a lighter purse after gifting the people there with a dragon or two. South they rode again, and as they rode through the Barrowlands he could see that word of their ride was going on ahead of them again, judging by the looks and the cheers that they were getting. And he saw something else on more and more faces, worry mixed with hope that the sight of him. When he finally caught sight of Barrowtown, with Barrow Hall in the middle of it, he clenched the reins so hard that he heard his leather riding gloves creak more than a bit. Beyond the hill that Barrowtown was nestled on was a flat area, and it was covered with a fog that to his eyes looked wrong. But then he forced himself to relax his grip and concentrated on looking as the Lord of the North should look, focused and intent and above all in charge. The cheering started as they approached the gates of Barrowtown, and the standards of House Stark and to a lesser extent House Baratheon were sighted by the crowds of people on the streets. As a way was cleared for them by men in Dustin livery, he wondered what Barbary Dustin thought about her people cheering so hard for House Stark. As they finally arrived in front of Barrow Hall he got his answer. Barbary Dustin was in the main courtyard, her father standing at her side and the household of Barrow Hall behind them. Lady Dustin was as white as a sheet, black shadows under her eyes and a look of badly hidden worry and strain. Lord Ryswell did not look quite as bad, but he was obviously worried, especially as he caught sight of Stannis Baratheon. He actually flinched a little. But that was as nothing as to the reaction of Barbary Dustin when she caught sight of Brandon Dustin. She flushed with some undefinable emotion, before wrenching her gaze away from him and back to Ned's direction. As Ned dismounted he pulled the Fist of Winter out of the leather case it had been resting on his saddle as he rode, and back to its proper place at his waist. At the same time Frostfear padded up next to him and then sat down and stared at the Lady of Barrowtown, something that Barbary Dustin seemed to find very disturbing. Lady Dustin, Ned said as he and Stannis strode up to the pair of them. Lord Ryswell. Lord Stark, Barbary Dustin said tightly, my Lord Hand. There was a pause and then, possibly prompted by a nudge from her father, bread and salt, my lords. They partook from the plates handed over by a servant, before Ned looked back at Lady Dustin. We must talk at once. Barbary Dustin flinched a little, but then nodded choppily as she turned towards the doors to the main hall, and he followed her, along with Ryswell, Stannis and, after a gesture from him, Brandon Dustin. And, of course, Frostfear. After a moment Barbary Dustin seemed to realize exactly who was following her, because she turned. Not him. Ned looked at a faltering Brandon Dustin. He comes, he said in a voice that booked no argument. You have no say in this matter. Barbary looked at him in protest, but then Stannis added his own voice, Lord Stark is right on this. She pulled a face and then led them on to a room to one side of the great hall of the castle that had a desk and some chairs. Ned closed the door firmly behind them all and then glared at Barbary Dustin. Lady Dustin, I am not pleased to be here, and am still less pleased that you expelled my personal envoy Lord Brandon Dustin. This matter of the fog is still unresolved, and Lord Brandon was sent here as my advance guard. Barbary Dustin came very close to wringing her hands in what was either worry or despair. I have tried to resolve it, Lord Stark. But there is nothing in the books here about it, nothing in the local legends. And Lord Brandon, he is a Dustin of Isozi, of the Company of the Rose, he knows nothing about this matter. She raised her jaw. I could not allow him to meddle in this matter. Ned's own chin came up at this and he took a long stride towards her, whilst to one side Frostfear visibly bristled. He had her measure at once. Lady Dustin, I told you at Castle Black that Barrowtown was yours and that I would not supplant you with Lord Brandon. Lord Brandon knows this. He is trying to help. And yet you refused his counsel and bade him and his sons leave. You are placing me in a delicate position, Lady Dustin. The fog grows worse, not better, and your actions make no sense. She looked at almost everything in the room but him and her late husband's cousin. He knows nothing, and do not make me take back the words I said at Castle Black. Ned half roared the words and Barbary Dustin and her father both flinched at the look of black fury on his face. He forced himself to be calm again. We must work together on this. And then something happened that made him blink with surprise. Barbary Dustin stared at the floor and then walked up to him. "Please send him away," she all but whispered. "I will explain later, in private." "I cannot," he said more gently. "This matter of the fog is too important. People are close to leaving Barrowtown because of this, did you know that?" "But yes, we will meet in private for you to explain." She looked at him, that look combining anger and worry and frustration and for some reason shame, and then she slowly nodded choppily. Ned looked at her closely and then sighed. "So the books here at Barrow Hall are of no use?" "None." She said the word with flat despair. "What does the maester say?" Stannis asked. "There is none," Brandon Dustin said with a sigh. "Lady Dustin, apparently distrusts them." "They are naught but grey rats," Barbary said with a flash of her old fire. And then she looked at him and the fire died. "I dismissed the last one. He was meddling in Willam's solar." There was a short silence as various looks were traded and then, reluctantly, Brandon Dustin said, "Was there nothing even in the Grey Book?" The words were met with a blank look from Barbary. "Grey Book?" Brandon Dustin stood straighter. "The Grey Book of the Dustins." He looked uncomfortable. "It is a secret thing, something not normally talked of in front of strangers, but my father told me of it. It tells of the history of the Barrowlands and the ceremonies that Dustins must do." Ned wanted to close his eyes and then cover them with his hand. More bloody ancient family secrets. Would he never be rid of them? But Barbary Dustin still stared blankly. "What Grey Book?" "It would be in Lord Willam Dustin's solar. From what my father told me of it, 'tis a large book, bound in grey leather, about this size," and Brandon Dustin held his hands out to illustrate. "It would have been amidst Lord Dustin's most prized possessions. It's written entirely in the language of the First Men. There was no book like that in the solar when I took it over." She did not look directly at Brandon Dustin, but the man looked horrified. "What? Are you sure?" Once again she would not look at him, just nodding instead. "Take us to your solar. At once." Stannis made it a command and not a request, and despite a brief bout of blustering, Barbary Dustin obeyed that order. The solar was neat and tidy, with books placed neatly on shelves along one wall and various maps and other papers rolled up just as neatly on the large desk. But there was no Grey Book. Ned drummed his fingers on the table for a moment and then looked about. "Search the room." They searched. Ned hoped that there would be something similar to his solar at Winterfell, a room hidden behind a tapestry or some hidden partition somewhere, but there was nothing. They tapped on the walls, they looked behind the books and even all through the books, but there was no Grey Book written in the language of the First Men. Ned looked around the solar as they completed their search, before looking at a white-faced Barbary Dustin. He was angry, one hand on the fist and Frost-Fyr's hackles were up to one side. "Search Barrow Hall. Every part of it. Find that book." Barbary Dustin took one look at his face and flinched violently, stepping back with a look of almost fright. After a long moment she nodded and then came close to running to the door to summon servants and bark out orders. Over the next few hours Barrow Hall was all but turned upside and shaken. Servants and guardsmen searched everywhere, aided by those who had rode south with Ned. Based on a hunch from Ned they searched the room of the former maester, which was now a storeroom, but there was nothing there, no Grey Book, nothing. As for Maester himself, he was long dead according to one of the servants. As the chaos erupted around them, Ned finally pulled Barbary Dustin to one side in a room. "We have time now. Explain." She did not look at him, but at everywhere else in the room for a long moment. Finally she said, "Lord Brandon. I did not mean to dismiss him." A look of deep distress crossed her face. "Lord Stark. I honor the memory of Willam. I do. I remember his face. Lord Brandon, he has Willam's eyes. And his smile. And he looks," and then she looked genuinely anguished as she seemed to search for words. Ned's eyes widened as realization struck. He opened his mouth for a long moment, reconsidered what he was about to say and then closed it. Finally he said, very carefully, "You consider Brandon Dustin, comely." The word made Barbary Dustin close her eyes as if in pain. "I don't. I mean, I can't. Lord Stark. I have for so many years grieved over Willam. And resented you, hated you for not bringing his bones back. There was a pause as she wrestled with a large number of emotions. It's all I have. Grief and hate. It's hollowed me out. I have no room for anything else. She said the last words in a defeated tone of voice. Pity kindled in his heart. Barbary, he said quietly, we all know what's coming. At the wall. And we all know what drives it. The others are coming and they bring death. We have to fight death with life. And to be alive is to be many things. I've long felt regret for not bringing Willam's bones back. As I am bound for the Reach after here, I vow to you now that I will visit where Willam fell and retrieve his bones, so that he can be buried with his ancestors. And as for you live. You can honor Willam's memory and do your best to be happy at the same time. Don't stay trapped in grief and hate. Willam wouldn't have wanted that. Barbary looked at him and there were tears in her eyes. You make it sound so easy. It's really not. But you have to try at least. She wiped her eyes and then nodded a little. As they left the room they heard raised voices ahead and after a moment one of Barrow Hall's servants scurried into view. My lord, my lady, we've found something. In the library. They had indeed found something, a shrouded shape that apparently had been hidden in an alcove behind a shelf with a large number of books on it. Books left by the old maester apparently. Ned looked at it, once they all reconvened in the solar. It was in the shape of a small chest, but it was covered in oilskin that had been stitched tight, so he pulled out his knife and cut it carefully open. Underneath was a similar tight layer of coarse linen and under that was a layer of finer linen, before they finally saw wood. Who was this maester again? Ned asked as John helped him to cut away all the layers and reveal the small chest that lay within. Aylward Barbary Dustin muttered to one side. An annoying man who tried to lecture me on what Willam would do. I dismissed him for many reasons, the last being he was in here without my permission. She sighed. He must have taken the book. The chest was locked but that was not a problem as the key to it was tied to one of the carrying handles on its side. Ned took the key, inserted it into the lock and then paused. Wait, someone bring me some oil for this. Oil was brought and inserted into the lock, just barely enough because the bloody thing stuck a bit before it finally turned. Ned opened the top and then paused. There was a note within, resting on what looked like a number of book-shaped objects tightly wrapped in cloth. He picked it up. For the new Lord Dustin, when he comes. So he stepped away from the chest. Lady Dustin, this is yours I believe. Barbary Dustin sent him a veiled look of something he was not sure he could identify, and then stepped up to the desk. With hands that trembled more than a bit she pulled the topmost shape up and then peered at it, before placing it gently on the desk and then using Ned's dagger to cut through the stitches that confined what was within. And what was within was a large book that was bound in grey leather. The moment that Ned saw it he all but sighed with relief. He picked it up and then passed it over to Barbary Dustin. This belongs to you I believe, Lady Dustin. Barbary Dustin took it with an odd look on her face, as if she had expected him to do something else, before putting it on the desk and drawing up a chair. And then she did something that made Ned blink. She took a deep breath and said, Lord Brandon, you can read the language of the first men I believe. I can, came the reply. My father and grandfather taught me. Then please, she seemed to gird herself. Assist me in looking at this book. In a matter of this importance I think that 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Ned schooled his face as Brandon Dustin nodded carefully, drew up a chair and then joined her in starting to read. Ned watched them for a moment, thinking of a pair of cats that were circling each other, and then joined John and Lord Riswell at the chest, where they were pulling out and unwrapping more books. All were bound in grey leather and seemed to be progressively older and older as they emerged from the chest. And there were 6 of them. Ned took one and carefully opened it, before opening another one and looking at the same page. They were written in different hands but the language was identical. They're all copies of the same book, Father John said wonderingly. Past Dustins must have seen this as so important that they ordered copies to be made at regular intervals. The Maester knew that they were important, Ned muttered. He put them away for safety. But why tell no one? Riswell leant closer. My daughter does not like Maesters, he said softly. If he had said that these were very important, I am not sure if she would have listened. He said it quietly, but a red spot had appeared on the cheeks of his daughter and she was obviously repressing a sharp word at her father. He kept the books safe and for that I thank his memory. Ned nodded. He was of a mind to suggest that a book be sent to Sheristone, as Daisy would find it fascinating, but he had a feeling that now was not the time to suggest anything like that. And then they waited as the two Dustins sat at the table and pored over the book, turning pages only after both had read and then nodded over it. Brandon looked fascinated whilst Barbary looked more than a little wistful at times, probably as she thought of Willam and the absence of little Dustins of her own. But then, as they made their way through the book, he noticed new emotions from the pair of them. Surprise, shock even, and then growing worry that seemed to almost become alarm. The two reached one particular page, leant back a little in shock, read on, looked at each other grimly and then turned the page, where the process was repeated. Brandon then inserted a page marker, turned back a few pages, placed a finger on a few lines and looked at Barbary, who turned white but then nodded. They then looked up at Ned. Lord Stark, they both said almost simultaneously, before looking at each other. Brandon leant back and gestured at his late cousin's wife. Lord Stark, Barbary said in a shaking voice. We know what the fog is. She raised a shaking hand to her face and then stood abruptly and walked to one side. The fog is the spirits of the dead. There was a startled silence that was broken by Roderick Riswell, who sighed and sank into a chair. I feared that. The voices alone, what do they want though? But Barbary Dustin seemed to be too shaken to answer and instead waved a hand at Brandon Dustin, who sighed and looked around the room at them all. This tale dates back to the long night. When the others started to roll south, attacking the first men and turning them into whites, well, news traveled slowly at first and was not always believed. Then when it became clear that it was true, again it varied. Some fought. Some fled. And some tried to court favor with these powerful creatures. They worshipped them in the hope that they would be killed last. When it became clear that the only course of action was to fight, your ancestor Lord Stark called for a great assemblage of the leaders of the first men and their supporters, here at Barrow Hill. They met here and they swore a great oath to ally themselves with the children of the forest and to fight and beat the others. They swore it at the Oathstone, by the barrow of the first king. Brandon Dustin paused and licked his lips. There were those at the Oathstone who knew that they were not trusted. They were those who had fled, or who had tried to worship the others. They knew that the men around them thought that they would break their word and flee or betray them. So, the oath that they swore was different. It was binding in ways that the other oaths were not. They swore a great and terrible oath to fight the others no matter what the cost, to fight them no matter how many of them died. The oath was binding for the rest of their lives and beyond. There was a long silence, one that was broken by Stannis Baratheon. And beyond? Meaning what? Beyond death, my lord, Hand Brandon Dustin said soberly. There could be no more binding oath than that. So that when the call was sent out it was heard by both the living and the dead. Ned felt the blood flee his face for a long moment. Then he thought it through. So the spirits of the dead who swore that oath are converging here, at the Oathstone. Aye, Lord Stark. Many of them died near here. There was a great battle against the others not far from here. Ned sighed. Very well, that is what the fog is. So how do we disperse it? Brandon Dustin looked at Barbary, who was still deeply affected by what she had read, and then gazed at Ned. One of the tasks, no, duties of the Dustin of Barrowtown is bound up with the call. When it is sent he must go to the Oathstone as soon as he can, place his hand on it and bid the dead to sleep again. Their assistance is not needed yet. The book says it will only be needed in the final battle against the thing that created them, when the dead will be commanded by. He looked down at the open book and then shook his head in clear puzzlement. The word is old and odd and needs translation by a better reader of the language of the first men than I am. The thought of the spirits of the dead marching with the living was one that made him shudder a little, but then he paused. But the Dustin of Barrowtown is by blood a Riswell, not a Dustin. Can it still work? Can we take Lady Dustin to the Oathstone and have her command them to sleep? He was answered with a shake of the head. No, Lord Stark, she is as you pointed out not a Dustin by blood. And I cannot do it either as I am not the Dustin in Barrowtown. But even if I married Lady Barbary tonight and laid with her until morning, Becoming Lord Dustin, I cannot disperse the fog and the dead. The book makes it clear that if too much time passes between the call being sent and the Dustin of Barrowtown commanding that the dead sleep again, then the command of the Dustin will not be enough. There will be too many dead as there are now. Too many will have woken, and other things besides according to the book. Only one man can command the dead to sleep now, the Stark who holds the fist of winter in one hand as he touches the oak stone with the other. He fell silent, not looking at Barbary Dustin, who was a little flushed. And it must just be you, Lord Stark. Only a Stark can do this. Everyone looked at him and he did his best not to wince too much as yet more weight was added to the burden he always carried. Me then, he said with a sigh. Me. Very well. I will go to the oak stone. Tomorrow, though, Roswell pointed out. The sun is setting now. You cannot ride to the oak stone, no horse will approach that fog and you get lost too easily in the growing dark. You must do it tomorrow. Ned nodded. Very well. The evening meal in the great hall was a quiet affair. Not melancholy, not sad, no foreboding exactly, but most were lost in their thoughts. Ned found himself wondering what it would be like to walk through a fog that was made up of the spirits of the dead, whilst to one side John seemed to be thinking very hard. As for Barbary Dustin, she was staring more at her plate than anywhere else. And above all, Ned found himself with a piece of song stuck in his head, something that after a while he found himself humming softly. I said John quietly next to him, I've been thinking about the same song, Father. Jenny of Old Stones, is it not? It seems fitting, Ned said with a slight smile. Tomorrow I hopefully won't be dancing with ghosts. What's Jenny of Old Stones? Grid said the words through a mouthful of bread. No one quite knew how to deal with her, as a member of the party of Lord Stark and the Lord Hand, but also not of the nobility. A song, said Ned, thinking of the different times that he had heard it. About the wife of the Prince of Dragonflies. Oh. Grid said, her brow wrinkling. A prince made of dragonflies. Ned almost laughed. No, he was Duncan Targaryen, who died at Summerhall. The Green Man knew him. Grid opened her mouth again and he could tell that the next words she was going to say were on the lines of how does it do, when something happened that he would never have thought possible. Barbary Dustin raised her head and started to sing in a high, clear voice. High in the halls of the kings who are gone, Jenny would dance with her ghosts. The ones she had lost and the ones she had found, and the ones who had loved her the most. The ones who'd been gone for so very long, she couldn't remember their names. There was total silence in the hall, as they all listened to the Lady of Barrowtown sing. Grid's mouth had dropped open and all of a sudden Ned was reminded of Lyanna at Harrenhal. They spun her around on the damp old stones, spun away all her sorrow and pain. And she never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave. There were tears in her eyes now, but still she sat upright and sang. They danced through the day, and into the night through the snow that swept through the hall. From winter to summer, then winter again, till the walls did crumble and fall. And she never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave. And she never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave, never wanted to leave. The tears were sliding down her cheeks now, but still she sat upright and kept on singing. High in the halls of the kings who are gone. Jenny would dance with her ghosts. The ones she had lost and the ones she had found, and the ones who had loved her the most. She fell silent and just sat there, and Ned had no idea if she had been singing for the living or the dead. After a long moment she reached out and picked up her goblet. To your success at the Oakstone, Lord Stark. It was an apt toast, and after a slight pause Ned and the others also raised their goblets and drank. Oddly enough, for a man who was going to take a walk through a fog filled with the spirits of the dead, he slept very well that night, probably because he was utterly exhausted. He didn't even dream much, although from what he could remember his dreams were of home and cat. In the morning he broke his fast in his room, a simple meal that involved bread and ham and small beer. As he ate he studied a small map of the area about the Great Barrow to memorize the path to the Oakstone, and also watched at Frostfire, who looked back at him levelly. If horses would not go near the fog, would a direwolf? He didn't think so, but he did not know, and he sighed a little as he finished his food and stood, pushing the fist of winter into the loop in his belt and then striding out of his room and down the corridor. It was early and the hole was still stirring, but there seemed to be quite a few servants about who watched him and nodded formally, in the manner of the North, in respect and acknowledgement of what he was doing. He met Stannis at the main gates, where the hand of the king nodded in respect himself and then shook hands with him and bade him luck gruffly. Barbary Dustin was standing to one side and he acknowledged her nod and that of Brandon Dustin to one side as well. Theon and Asher acknowledged him on the other side, concern on the face of the first, respect on the other. Ygritte was there as well, looking both irritated and concerned, he knew not why. The courtyard was silent as he passed through the gates and down through the town. Word had passed before him and the streets were filled with people, although a path was always open through them for him and his direwolf. Men and women nodded and muttered their support, as if afraid to speak too loudly, and he would nod back now and then from side to side, hoping that he did not let these good people down. And then, at the main gates of Barrowtown he saw someone who made him stop. Jon was standing there, Ghost at his feet and Dark Sister at his hip. "Father." "Jon. I am going with you." "No," he said with a shake of his head. "You are not. We don't know what's out there in that fog, it's too dangerous. I will not put you at risk." "Father, only we can do this. I am a Stark, am I not?" "You are," he said, feeling irritated. But if you trip over a stone on the barrows and break your leg, who would know about it? Who could pick up the fist and use it? You need someone to guard you out there, father, someone who can also use the fist. You need me. Come on." And with that Jon started to walk towards the fog. He swore under his breath and strode after his blasted son, no, nephew, repressing the need to strangle him. "Jon. We are not going to argue about this, father. Accept my help." Jon stopped and looked at him. "Trust me on this. You need me." He looked into those all too familiar eyes for a long moment. And then he sighed and nodded reluctantly. "Very well. But if I say run, you bloody well run, do you hear me?" "I understand, father." On they went, towards the fog, and as they approached it felt more than saw the hackles go up on the back of Frostfyr. He looked at both direwolves and could see at a glance that they were both becoming distressed, but wanted to continue. "Jon." He gestured at the direwolves and then saw the boy realize what was going on. He turned to the two creatures. "Stay. Wait. We will return." The direwolves stared at him, obviously conflicted, before sitting and then dipping their muzzles in compliance. On they strode, to the very start of the fog, and he felt his skin crawl as the tendrils of mist envelop him. He looked up at the sun, found his bearings and then looked at Jon. "Keep your wits about you. And we need to walk in this direction." He gestured with one hand, whilst keeping the other on the fist almost instinctively. As they kept walking he stretched out with all his senses. Brandon Dustin had mentioned that he and his sons had heard the sound of voices in the fog, and after a long moment he felt his nostrils narrow as he also heard something. There were voices, faint at first but then growing a little louder, speaking the language of the first men, or an archaic version of it. "They come. They come. Watch to the right. Spears and shields. Spears and shields. Go for the tendons. We are the living. We are life. Beat back the dead. Send them back to the shadow that awaits them." He could tell that Jon could hear them as well, and he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ignore them. They are long dead." He hoped they were dead anyway, as the fog billowed about them, fading at times just enough for him to catch a sight of the sun and guess at their bearings. As they strode on, the fog would thicken every now and then, and sometimes he could see shapes in it, the shapes of men and even women dressed in old armor, walking or running or even swinging pale swords or axes against something unseen. And then abruptly the fog thickened and he paused. Suddenly something felt very wrong, and as his senses screamed at him he pulled the fist of winter out of its loop at his waist and hefted it. Jon felt the same way, judging by the sound of Dark Sister being pulled from its scabbard, and they stopped and stood back to back. "Something is coming," he muttered. "I feel it." The fog broiled to one side and they both turned to face it, and then something out of his darkest nightmares seemed to form itself of the fog. Its feet were no more than vapor and mist, but its body looked like several rib cages of men joined together, with many arms and a head made from at least 3 skulls fused together. It screamed at them with a voice that spoke of madness and then hefted a blade spun from ebonite at them. Ned swallowed and somehow got the fist up into a guard position before the two weapons met with an unearthly noise. The impact rocked him back on his feet and he grunted with effort, but he could see that the fist had notched a jagged rent in the blade of whatever the hell this thing wielded. The thing gaped or seemed to gape at him, and then he used that moment of astonishment to his advantage, bringing the fist down again onto the blade, shattering it to pieces before he reversed his impetus and brought the fist back around and smashed its head to pieces. The thing didn't even have a chance to scream, and he stared as it disintegrated into mist as it fell to the ground. "Father," said John shakily, "what was that?" "I don't know," he replied. "But some of the books said that the others did not make just whites at the beginning. When they had time, they got inventive." He shook his head. "Be wary." They strode on, more watchful than they had been previously. He hoped that they were on the right path towards the oakstone, and as they walked up and over first one barrow and then another he realized that they were not too far away. But then the fog thickened again and again they stood back to back. For long singing moments they watched around them. And then it started to get cold, as their breath started to appear in the air about them. John stiffened in shock. "Father, it's like it was beyond the wall at the night fort. When the others attacked." He looked about and then something blue started to swirl into existence from the fog. Deeper and deeper the cold became, and then all of a sudden something came into brutal focus. He recognized it at once from the descriptions. The shade of another. It looked about its surroundings almost wonderingly for a long moment, and then it drew a pale sword that flickered about its edges and looked at them. Ned drew himself up as the thing raised its weapon, but it was John who met the stroke that fell, and the pale sword shattered on impact, astonishing the shade but being met with a grin by John, despite the blood that the shards inflicted as they glanced past his forehead. John didn't even flinch as he then brought Dark Sister around and sliced through the shade of the other, which shattered into 1,000 pieces. They moved on again, deeper into the fog, and it was then that Ned realized that he could not even see the sun above them and that he did not know exactly where they were. He stared at the ground carefully, still doing his best to keep an eye on approaching threats. "Where's the nearest barrow?" John paused and he looked about himself. "Over there." "I think that," but he was interrupted by a broiling in the fog again, before something once again emerged. Like the first thing to come from the fog, it was from his deepest nightmares, a creature made from tendon and bone with many arms and legs, one of which opened up a cut just about his right eye as he darted back just in time. Unpleasant as it was, it died quickly. It mewed with what might have been pain when they both struck at it with their weapons and then flailed at them again, leaving a long but shallow cut on his leg and cutting John's arm as well. The fist and Dark Sister rose and fell, shattering the white form into pieces as they hammered it to pieces. Blowing hard as he looked about, Ned winced a little as he looked at the blood on them both. He opened his mouth to tell John to look for the oakstone again, when all of a sudden two things happened. The first was that he caught sight of a pale light to one side through a rent in the fog. The second was that something deep in the fog uttered a roaring noise that made his blood run cold for an instant. "What in the name of all the old gods was that?" John gasped. "Let's not find out," Ned replied. "I think I saw a light over there." It was in the right direction and at least it didn't hurt too much to walk. They walked on through the suddenly thickening fog and then Ned and John stopped dead. There were figures in the fog, men and women in all kinds of armor, clutching ancient weapons. They were motionless, all staring in the same direction at the pale light ahead of them all. He squinted at it. Yes, it matched the description of the oakstone. But that light. He reached out and clutched at John's shoulder. He could tell at a glance that John was afraid. But then the thing in the fog bellowed again, closer this time, and they both started walking again, towards the upright standing stone, threading their way through the motionless figures. He looked over his shoulder and all of a sudden something vast and sinuous seemed to billow out of the fog, something that made the hairs on the back on his neck stand on end in sheer terror. Whatever it was, he knew at a glance that it could kill them both. They hurried on, getting closer and closer. They were less than 50 yards away now, dodging through the still ghosts. The bellow came again and then Ned noticed something else, two blue figures converging on them, obviously the spirits of others. He ran that, John at his side, straight for the oakstone. There was a pair of ghostly figures standing on each side of the oakstone, with a hand on its surface. One was unfamiliar to him, a tall man dressed in archaic armor with a glowing weapon that he couldn't quite see in his free hand. The other he knew. Lord William Dustin, his eyes glowing. As he stepped up to the oathstone, the late Lord of Barrowtown turned his head to look at him. Ned. He didn't know what to say, but eventually he replied, William. How are you here? His old friend laughed shortly. How could I not be? Barrowtown is in peril. The thing in the fog screamed again, far closer this time, and his breath was white vapor again. Ned. Step up, join us. Place your right hand on the oathstone and tell them to sleep again. In the old tongue. He stepped up, holding the fist in his left hand, and placed his right hand on the oathstone, which flared gold as he did so. Father! John cried as he caught sight of the others approaching quickly now, not to mention the other thing. Ned snatched a hurried look over his shoulder and caught sight of something huge and with far too many teeth emerging from the fog. He collected himself as the words clattered almost from nowhere into his head, and then threw his head back and roared in the language of the first men, Hearken to me! Hearken to me! I am the Stark in Winterfell. I hold the fist of winter. Sleep until the day when your oath will be fulfilled. Sleep. There was a moment of crystalline singing silence as the fog seemed to freeze into place, and then a column of light seemed to erupt out of the oathstone, up into the heavens above. The motionless figures shivered into life and then seemed to see Ned and the other figures by the oathstone, and all raised weapons to their lips and spoke words that Ned could not hear in an endless susurration, before bowing to them. The figures of the others seemed to be frozen in place, almost in mid-cower against the light, and the huge figure of the beast, and then a wind seemed to come from nowhere, a wind from the west. As it blew, the figures, all the ghostly figures, bar that of those who were touching the oathstone, shimmered and then faded, taking with them the ghosts of the enemies of the people of Westeros. The fog faded, slowly at first, but then with growing speed, and Ned could see that William and the other ghost were also fading. William, thank you. Are you really here? An echo of me, Ned, just an echo. Tell Barbary to live again, will you? It saddens me to see her so bitter. Ned nodded and then looked at the other man. Are you an ancestor of William Dustin? The other man laughed, an echoing sound that started to fade as fast as he was. Nay, I am an ancestor of yours. He smiled. I built a lot of things. And with that he was gone, and Ned and John stood together, just them alone, by the oathstone, with the sun on their faces and the wind tugging at their hair and their blooded faces. Chapter 45. Chapter text. Sorry for the delay on this. My new company has had us all working from home and producing not just articles for the magazine but also webinars. Don't ask, it's all been very complicated and not a little stressful. However, we've proved that it can work. That said, the conference season is screwed, so we have to find ways to replace the revenue that we have lost. Frankly, we are insanely lucky, we have not lost anyone and we have jobs. So, stay safe, wear a mask, wash your hands, be kind to each other, and above all else don't take this thing lightly. Theon. He did not remember what he dreamt of that night, but whatever the dream was, it made him awake in a hurry, covered in sweat. Jagged memories of the dream clashed in his head for a moment, but then they faded. He looked down at the weirwood pendant around his neck that never left him these days. There were times when he wondered if the drowned god was still looking for him, kept at bay by the old gods. He'd discussed it quietly with Asher, who had told him everything about the room at High Harlaw that Nuncle Roderick had found, along with his new wife, everything about the glowing runes and what they had said. He'd already heard the tale in the letters that he'd exchanged with his nuncle, but it was the way that Asher told the tale that stuck in the mind. The look in her eyes as she talked about the runes and the tale that they told. Sleep was impossible after that, and he called for hot water, sponged the sweat off, and then went for a walk on the battlements with mist, looking down every now and then at the fog on the barrows as the sun rose in the west. It still made him shiver to think that it literally the spirits of the long dead. You couldn't sleep either. Asher was standing to one side, looking a bit bleary-eyed. She joined him at the battlements and stared out at the mist as well. Takes me aback just seeing that stuff out there. He nodded somberly. The dead of the north. The ancient dead. Mist looked up at him with what almost looked like worry on his face. And then Theon shivered a little. Come on. Lord Stark will be leaving soon. Until his dying day he remembered the moment that the dark-haired, grey-eyed Lord of the North came into view, his cloak billowing a little as he walked and the fist of winter at his hip. There were others there at the gate, Lord Stannis Baratheon, the Dustins, who seemed to be doing an odd dance around each other, obviously uneasy but darting odd little looks at each other, and Ygritte. He nodded at Lord Stark, getting a small smile and a nod in response, and then the Lord of the North was gone, striding off through the gates and past the almost silent crowds of people who made a path for him as he went. The little knot of people by the gate loitered for a while, muttering about what might happen next, and then headed up to the walls again, although Ygritte stayed at the bottom and seemed to be looking for someone. Ah! Where was Jon? Had he said goodbye to his father inside? He shrugged mentally and then headed up to the wall, following Asher. And it was there that he caught sight of the two figures, plus direwolves, that strode out of the main gates of Barrowtown and headed towards the fog. Jon. It could only be Jon. He frowned for a moment as some of the others muttered their puzzlement and then he sighed. It's Jon with him. Jon Stark. You what? The words came from Ygritte, who had frozen in place on the stairs up to the wall. Jon's where? She hurried up the remaining stairs and peered out. When she saw the figures vanish into the fog, without the direwolves who stayed outside, she made an inarticulate noise of high emotion, part rage, part, well, something that Theon couldn't identify. I'll kill him, the wilderling finally said eventually. I'll go down there, drag him out of that mist and tell him he's an idiot and then I'll kill him. You'll not. Theon said the words firmly. He's the only one of us that could help Lord Stark. Everyone stared at him and he flushed a little. Only a Stark can wield the fist. Jon's the only one of us who could pick the fist and use it at the Oathstone if something happens to Lord Stark in that mist. Their blood. It's as simple as that. Stannis Baratheon pulled a slight face and then nodded, whilst Ygritte almost vibrated with indecision. It was Asher who took pity on her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Once he comes back out, you two need to talk. Use a bedroom. You might need to use short words. But tell him how you feel. Ygritte went bright red as her lips thinned, before making a gallant effort at scoffing. She fooled no one on the wall, as even Barbary Dustin raised her eyebrows and then shook her head a little in amusement. But then the wilderling licked her lips, hung her head and rejoined them at the wall as they all returned to staring out at the mist. It was Mist who seemed to feel something first. He vuffed in an almost puzzled manner, stretched up to place his paws on the lowest part of the wall and then let out a half howl, half moan of distress. Then looked at him, puzzled, and then Stannis Baratheon let out an oath. What in the name of all the gods is that? Theon stared at where the hand of the king was looking and then he saw the mist ripple and tear as something huge seemed to rear up just beneath the surface. Theon thought he saw spikes of some sort on a very bony spine and he shivered. He wasn't the only one. Barbary Dustin took a step back and then seemed to move a little slower to Brandon Dustin, who was as grim-faced as Theon felt. What the fuck was that? Ygritte almost whispered. I've never seen anything like that. Brandon Dustin had turned very pale. Who know what has awakened out there? There were battles against the others and the things that they created. If some of those spirits, those of the things that the first men fought against, have awakened, he stopped speaking, suddenly dumb with horror, and his knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists. A tense silence fell, as Ygritte looked from face to face. Well, why aren't we helping them? We can't. Theon said heavily. They're too deep into the fog. We'd never find them. And we don't have anything that could harm whatever that was. And he was interrupted by a far-off but still horrible roaring sound that was utterly unearthly and which silenced Barrowtown utterly. Afterwards he could never remember how long they all stood there, frozen with tension and worry. The fog billowed again and again with the passage of the, whatever the hells it was. Something huge and horrible, and it was Stannis Baratheon who said what he was fearing. It's hunting them. On and on the waiting stretched out, as they watched the fog. Asher's nostrils were flared with tension and Ygritte had a wild look to her eyes. There was a faint noise of distress to one side and Theon looked over to see a red-faced Barbary Dustin remove a hand from the arm of her late husband's cousin, as she had obviously been clutching it too hard. Your pardon, she said in a small and trembling voice. If Ned Stark dies out there, Then the North will remember me in a way that will be most ill. The waiting stretched on, and then the head of something from his darkest nightmares once again reared out of the fog. It had a lot of teeth and it made a roaring noise that made him shiver again. He winced at it, wondering what was going on in the midst of that damn fog, and then something happened. The fog seemed to shiver and freeze in place for a moment. And then a shaft of golden light punched its way out of the fog and speared up into the sky, almost too bright to look at. Everyone flinched away a little from it as they raised their hands against their eyes, but then the light faded. There was a long moment of silence, before they all felt the first caress of a wind from the west, not hard but persistent, and with every puff the fog started to fade from sight. They watched almost uncomprehending, until finally Theon grinned and punched the air with his fist. They did it. But some of those around him seemed more uncertain about that, until the fog faded completely and a pair of distant figures limped into sight, one helping the other and both swiftly joined by direwolves. They did not lack for help after that. The people of Barrowtown surged out, with horses for the two to ride, and the cheers shook the skies above them. Theon joined the others as they pattered down the stairs and then waited by the gates, amused by the muttered comments from Ygritte about just how she was going to kill Jon Bloody Stark. Her voice was wobbling about like a child's top. As the Starks rode in through the gates, flanked by guards in dustin colors who had acted as an honor guard, Theon hissed a little as he looked at them. Both were battered and had cuts and dried blood on them, and Stannis Baratheon at once roared for help for them. There might not have been a maester at Barrow, but there were those who could tend to wounds, and hot water, clean cloths and bandages were soon brought out as the two Starks were tended to. And it was then that Ygritte literally loomed over Jon and prodded him in the shoulder. "What the hell were you thinking, Jon Stark? Going out there without letting me know?" "I had to help Father," Jon said with an air of quiet authority. "If he fell, I was the only one who could wield the fist at the Oathstone." This was both true and something that seemed to absolutely enrage Ygritte, who spluttered incoherently and then jabbed at him again with the same finger. Jon just stared into her eyes levelly. "I had to help Father." Ygritte stopped poking at him. "You should have told me." "Why? I could have." "Done what?" "Waited with the direwolves." This provoked more splutterings, and then Asha nudged at her with an elbow and gave her a look so pointed that it could have been used as an arrow. The wilderling girl went white as a sheet and then red, and then she leant down, kissed Jon with an urgent fierceness, slapped him around the face and then stalked off, leaving a flabbergasted Jon looking extremely confused. For some reason Asha looked smug. "They'll do very well together," she whispered to Theon. "Gods know what the children will be like though." Ned Stark obviously thought the same thing, but was talking quietly to the others, and Theon drifted over. "We had help at the Oathstone, help you need to hear about," Lord Stark told Stannis Baratheon and the Dustins. "Willam was there, Lady Dustin." Barbary Dustin went even whiter than Asha had, her hands going to her chest. Willam. He was there. I mean here." An echo of him. Or so he called himself. "He said that he was there because Barrowtown was in peril. He told me to place my hand on the Oathstone. I did, holding the fist, and told the dead to sleep. They did." "That light," Brandon Dustin said with a look of astonishment on his face. "It came from the Oathstone." "It did. And the dead faded from sight, Willam too. And the spirits of the others that were in mist. We battled our way there. And there were other things that I think that the others made. Things of sinew and bone. Terrible things. But we made it." Lady Dustin muttered. Then she pulled a slight face. Did Willam say anything?" Lord Stark nodded. "He did. He told you to live. That it saddened him to see you so bitter. And then he was gone, along with the other spirit that was there." He paused and scratched his head a little in bemusement, obviously trying not to look at Lady Dustin, who was visibly struggling with her emotions. "He said that he was my ancestor and he built a lot of things. I think he must have been Bran the Builder. I didn't know that he was connected to here." "There might be something in the books," Brandon Dustin muttered, also not looking at Lady Dustin. I mean we, can check." "The fog is gone," Lord Stark said seriously. "The old gods willing it will never come back, not until the call is sent out again, and we will all be long dead by then, with luck." And now we know what the others might still have north of the wall. So we must be about this work of ours. There was a long moment of strained silence. And then they went about it. John in. It really did give him the willies, watching people stride on and off the ships moored at the heavily guarded area of the docks. Given what the holds of those ships now carried. He shivered a little and then watched as two people in particular walk off the closest vessel. Prince Oberyn Martell and Sir Davos Seaworth were talking in low, intent, but as they drew closer he could hear that they were both content. They were also looking down at something in Seaworth's hand. Is all well? The two looked up at him and then nodded simultaneously. As well as it can be, Oberyn Martell sighed. We've solved the problem of keeping the barrels in place. Sand at the bottom, sheepskins around the barrels, and then there's the wooden panels on top of them. The thought of nails being used is terrifying, so instead we will use these. And with that he held out a long nail-like object. He took it and stared at it. There was a spiral flange along its length. A screw auger, Sir Davos said quietly. Something the Street of Steel is making in great numbers. At his direction the Dornishman said with a smile. It was his idea. And as King's Landing wants these ships out of this harbor as fast as possible, the Street of Steel is making these things for almost nothing. Tricky to make, some of them go one way and some go the other, but they are making them as fast as we need them. We're ready, my lord and sir. We're ready. We can add the powders to the barrels tomorrow, screw the lids in place, do the same with the panels and then sail on the first tide. It'll be good to have the ships out of here. You both intend to sail with them? We are, Seaworth rumbled. I've assembled a good set of crewmen for the ships. They are being paid well enough for it, and if they never return then their families will be paid a pension. They are willing to risk being blown to smithereens. And they've all been questioned after the incident with that mad Septon. John felt his scalp crawl a bit. What incident? The other two men exchanged wry glances. Oh, said Oberyn Martell, he was a most earnest and plausible and in no way, stinky fellow who tried to get on board one of the ships, explaining to the guards that as King's Landing was filled with heathens and corruption, and as fire cleansed and wildfire really cleansed, it was his sacred duty to ignite the barrels and purge the city of all but the true believers. He was told to bugger off, Sir Davos said bluntly. I was going to have him arrested, but apparently he announced that the seven were with him and would allow him to walk across the narrow sea to Andalos, where he would be granted great favor by the new gods. He was last seen floating face down in Blackwater Bay as the tide took him out. John pursed his lips a little as he absorbed this information. Oh whoa. The other two men laughed a little and then they all turned and walked off towards the horses that were waiting with attendants to one side. But just before they got to them a pair of men stepped towards them, one a gold cloak and the other a man in rather weather-beaten clothing. The gold cloak raised a hand to Sir Davos and they had a quick and muttered conversation before the Onion Knight, he really needed a better name, cleared his throat and turned to Oberyn Martell. Prince Oberyn, this man has a message for you from the north. Oberyn Martell raised a languid eyebrow at the man, who bowed and then pulled a thick package bound in oilskin out from under his cloak. My prince, he said in the accent of a Dornishman, I was paid 5 dragons by an acolyte maester in Winterfell called Alras to deliver this into your hands at all costs. He coughed a little. He said that you would match that payment and said that there was a note beneath the oilskin to confirm this. There was an odd tone to his voice, as if he was trying to say something else that only Oberyn Martell might know. And the Dornish prince did. After a moment's pause he reached out, took the package, slit some of the stitching with his knife so that he could unwrap it enough to see the note and then read it carefully. And then he reached into a pocket to pull out a money pouch, extracted 5 gold dragons and handed them over. As promised. You have done well. You have my thanks. As the man strode off with the gold cloak, John raised an eyebrow at Oberyn Martell. You know this acolyte then? Oh yes, he grinned back at him with a toothy smile. I know him very well. You know that I have a daughter called Sarala, don't you? Oddly enough it was Sir Davos who worked it out first. Our Alras is Sarala backwards. Very good, Sir Davos, the Dornish prince said approvingly as he opened the rest of the package and then raised his eyebrows at the sheaf of papers inside. My daughter has sent a veritable nearbook of a report. He looked at them. I sent her to the north some time ago to investigate the call. It seems that she has done exactly that. So I have some reading ahead of me at the Red Keep. They hoisted themselves into their respective saddles and then rode off up the hill towards the heart of the city, and as they did John pondered on how long he would remain here before going home. The veil was pulling him homewards, and there was so much to do in order to meet the challenge that awaited them all. Yes, he needed to see his son again, and Ned, and above all help Robert with this great war that was upon them, but he was also tired. He was no longer a young man, he had had a brush with the stranger himself, and he needed to listen to what his body was telling him. But first he had his duties to perform. And above all there was the issue about Lysa. The first surprise that greeted them at the Red Keep was the sight of a familiar plump figure with a bald head, dressed in silks and with his hands up his sleeves. Varys. Lord Oberyn. The eunuch bowed politely. Ah, and Prince Oberyn and Sir Davos. I hear that you have been attending to the dangerous cargo in the ships at the docks. We have, John said as he dismounted and handed the reins to a groom. You have heard much of what has happened. I arrived a few hours ago, but my little birds have tried to keep me updated. It was not easy at times. He closed his eyes for a moment. Hearing that we have all been walking about over such huge caches of wildfire was distressing. And before you ask, no, I never even suspected at such a thing. I knew that Aerys Targaryen was plotting something with his last hand, but the Mad King made it very clear to me that if I investigated where I wasn't wanted, I'd be made to swallow a flagon of wildfire at once. As for my trip to Pentos, it was eventful. You were there when the Bravo Sea attacked. I was. It was disagreeably busy that day. They masked their approach most cleverly, and I barely had enough time to get away from the city on the landward side. The Bravo Sea Navy was very thorough in sweeping up and searching any who fled by sea. Which is why I had to spend far longer on SOs that I had planned. Was there much fighting? Oberyn Martell asked, his eyes glittering. The Master of Whispers nodded sadly. Some of the Magisters thought that they could fight. They were wrong. I left before things got too bad, but I saw much smoke from a distance. John nodded. War was war. Then he scowled a little. So, the Bravo Sea have the Targaryen girl and her dragons. Varys said with a tone of voice that made him raise an eyebrow at the eunuch. No, Lord Oberyn. The situation in Pentos that day was most confused, but I have since ascertained that Daenerys Targaryen was not captured by the Bravo Sea. Instead she seems to have vanished. No one in Pentos or indeed Bravos knows where she is. Or, for that matter, her dragons. It's a mystery that I am deploying my little birds to solve. Did one of the Magisters vanish off with her? Oberyn Martell asked, looking up with a frown from the papers he was leafing through. Alas, Varys said with very little sympathy in his voice, all the Magisters are accounted for. Those that were not captured were killed in the fighting. Humph. A mystery then. He nodded, and then they continued through the corridors of the Red Keep, with Varys regaling them with the tale of his escape from Pentos through a gate that was manned by an agent of his. And it was then that they heard Oberyn Martell stop dead behind them with an oath and an exclamation. The three turned to look at him. The Red Viper of Dawn looked genuinely astonished as he stared down at the papers in his hands. After a moment he seemed to sense their collective gaze and looked up. Your pardon, my lords and sir, he said in a low, stunned voice. It would seem that my daughter was north of the Night Fort with two of the sons of Ned Stark, along with Tyrion Lannister and his uncle Geryon. And they met and defeated a force of whites and others. He tilted his head to one side. I do not know if I should chastise her for risking herself like this or shatter into 1,000 pieces with pride. And then he held out a piece of parchment with a drawing on it. And the images in that drawing made his skin crawl. Sarala Sand could draw very well indeed. The image in front of them almost conveyed movement. I think that we need to retire to the small council chamber and read my daughter's report, my lords and sir. There is a lot here to consider. Varys. Whenever he was away he had a system for the messages from his little birds. They placed the slips of paper into a locked box that had a slot at the top. As long as they numbered them correctly, then sorting them out was easy but time-consuming when he returned to his rooms. At the moment he welcomed the tedium of sorting the slips into the right order and then reading them, losing himself in the relative humdrum task. The Game of Thrones was a finely nuanced one at times, with tides and shifts that sometimes could only be discerned from changes to marriage pacts or fosterings. Right now, however, the game was indeed in abeyance, although that would change as the news spread that the king was in possible need of a new bride, who had to be fertile and young and in no way resemble Cersei Lannister. He really needed that tedium after the mental excitement of the day. Oberyn Martell's bastard daughter was an excellent artist, whose pictures were detailed. Very detailed. Almost too detailed in their depiction of running whites. It was one thing to see a head in a cage. The images of running whites were disturbing. And then there had been the other parts of the thick report. The news of Ned Stark's lightning-fast trip south from Castle Black to Winterfell was rather disturbing, although it had not seemed to surprise Jon Arryn. The tale of how Ned Stark had discovered the treason of Cersei and Jaime Lannister had been detailed enough to make Oberyn Martell smirk a lot and Pycelle mutter even more. But it had been the postscript, hurriedly scribbled at the end, that had made everyone sit up and stare. There had been a drawing as well, one of an old man with forceful features and a hood with horns. Apparently the Green Man, not a green man, the Green Man was in Winterfell. And he had a name, or had once had another name. Sir Duncan the Tall. Once of the King's Guard of King Aegon the Unlikely. Supposedly dead since the tragedy of Summerhall. That had caused a lot of stunned silence and then a lot of scoffing, Pycelle excelling at that, and then a raven message had arrived from the king that had confirmed it with an almost absent-minded "oh by the way, this happened as well, oops I should have mentioned it earlier" statement. Whereupon the meeting had ended on a note of genuinely stunned silence. He paused from his labors and stared at the map on the wall again, his eyes finding Summerhall on it almost without thinking. He had always wondered about just what had happened there that night. Princess Rolla had said at the time that it had been Sir Duncan who had helped her to give birth to Rhaegar, before vanishing back into the burning building, but the body of Sir Duncan the Tall had never been found afterwards. The fires had been too intense to ascertain who had been who afterwards, but King Aegon's body, along with Prince Duncan, had been identified by their rings. Sir Duncan the Tall's body had never been found, although when he had later looked into it he had heard the odd rumor of a tall man in fine clothes who had wandered westwards away from Summerhall in the days after, one arm badly burned. At the time he'd put it down to a servant fleeing, or some other reason, but now he was no longer sure. Knuckles rapped against the door and he looked up with a quickly suppressed sigh. He had been expecting this. He slipped out of his chair and went to the door to open it to reveal, as he had thought, Prince Oberyn Martell. The Dornishman smirked at him, gave him an ironic salute with the goblet he was carrying, swaggered in, located a chair at random and then sat on it, before pouring himself a drink from the bottle of wine he was carrying in his other hand. "Ah, Varys. Prince Oberyn." He returned to his chair, stuck both hands up his sleeves and awaited the inevitable volley of impertinences. "You know, I do have wine in here. You didn't have to bring your own." "Saw." Oberyn muttered with a wry glance at him. "I don't trust you and you don't trust me. Nor should anyone trust the Red Viper of Dawn. Would you trust any drink that I personally poured?" He bowed his head a little in acknowledgement, poured himself a goblet of his favorite wine and then saluted the other man with it, who returned the gesture before they both drank. The Dornishman lowered the goblet from his lips and sighed. "Ah, what a day. Indeed." He paused. "I must say that your daughter is a very good draftsman. Her drawings from the wall are impressive. And, I have to say, rather frightening. Whites and others." His eyes lost their focus for a moment as he obviously thought about what it all meant. "Now we know what the true enemy is." He sighed, before looking about with some amusement. "I take it that your little birds do not eavesdrop on you." "Hardly," he replied with a certain amount of amusement. "I watch the watchers. And listeners. I take it that you wish to talk about a certain plan that we were discussing." Oberyn Martell nodded with a slight air of mournfulness. "It was a decent plan, with shades of a good plan. But it is now a very dead plan." He nodded. "Oh, I agree. It was not a perfect plan, but it was one that had a decent chance of working. And now we must plan for a war on the wall against creatures born of magic." He shuddered. Magic, how he hated the very idea of it. Oberyn Martell eyed him carefully. "You do not look happy about that fact." He pulled the slightest of faces. Magic is, well, to use the words of others, inconstant. Unpredictable. These others, who knows where they are really from or what they want? Sarala said that they want us all dead. Yes, but why? It seems so senseless. Ancient hatred, Zoberin said with a shrug. It's a good thing that our plan is dead now. And it is also good that a certain griffin-like person is dead. He eyed him sardonically, but Varys merely raised an eyebrow. I have my own sources in Essos. This morning I heard that there had been a tragic fire on a boat owned by that griffin-like person, who oddly enough was seen unmoving on the deck of that boat even as it burned. You took your time getting back from Pentos, so I presume that you paid a visit to that boat. He smiled thinly in response. Strange to think that ships that float on water can be so flammable. As for old Griff, as I believe that some called him, it's likely that he had something that disagreed with him and dropped his lantern. Tragic. The Dornishman smiled slightly and sipped from his goblet. Oh yes, tragic indeed. He had a son, didn't he? Whatever became of him? These kinds of deaths often run in the family. He died, or so I am told. Tragic, as I said. This got him a nod. Very true. Probably for the best. Old Griff could be somewhat obsessed in his beliefs. In his desire for revenge. That's what made him so useful. And now, alas, he is dead. A shame. Varys sipped from his own goblet. You really didn't know about the wildfire, did you? Oberyn Martell said as he topped up his goblet. He responded with a somewhat pointed glance. Do you really think that I would have worked in the Red Keep for so many years with the knowledge that there was a cache of maturing wildfire under me? He shuddered. No, I had no idea. I knew that Aerys Targaryen was working on something with his pet pyromancer that he had appointed as Hand of the King, but I did not know about the caches. I was told once that if I pried into the affairs of the increasingly mad king I would end up being forced into a barrel of wildfire. The other man nodded slowly. So Oberyn said after a long moment of what might have been mistaken for a companionable silence, you have Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons somewhere safe and secure. He grinned at the slight flicker of the eyes that Varys instantly regretted. I thought as much. You said that neither Pentos or Bravos know where she was and that you were deploying your little birds to find her. However, you did not say that you did not know where she was. He raised an eyebrow and was about to reply when the Dornishman waved a hand dismissively. Don't tell me where she is, it's enough to know that she and her dragons are safe. He sipped from his goblet and then his eyes hardened. We might need them. No, we will need them. Then he looked back at him. Is she sane? This was a good question and he paused and thought it over. Yes, he said eventually. I think that she is. At the present moment, anyway. Oberyn Martell looked at him doubtfully. You are sure? Her father was mad and of her two brothers the elder destroyed his own dynasty over a girl and a prophecy and the younger tried to murder her. I am aware, but so far she more resembles her mother than any of her male relatives. He sighed. However, that is not to say that she will stay sane. We must watch and wait. There was another moment of silence and then Oberyn Martell nodded and finished off the wine in his goblet. Agreed. Keep her safe and watch her. And I will go to the wall with the wildfire. I will say this much: life isn't boring at the moment. And with that he was gone, striding off with his bottle and goblet. Varys shook his head a little and returned to his messages. There was a lot to be done. Jaime. The further they rode the more he realized that so far he had barely scratched the surface of seeing the north. And so much of it was just empty, or had once been inhabited. Crumbled towers and ruined castles could sometimes be seen on the horizon, surrounded by trees or choked with ivy. But then there were also the signs of life. The castles that were being worked on, repaired, the inns that were being refurbished, the farms that were being cleared. Yes, he had seen so much of the same further south, but it was the way that the men around him were reacting that he was picking up. More often than not they made camp in copses or places that had access to dry brush that could be placed on a fire. Sometimes they stayed at inns, the kind of places that he would have scorned before, but now, even a small bath was now something that he looked forwards to with a sigh of pleasure. Something else he was looking forwards to was whenever the 7 hells this bloody short beard he was growing would stop itching. When they entered the new gift, how they could tell he had no idea. The muttering increased from the veterans of the Night's Watch. As far as he could tell, the area looked the same as the land to the south, if possibly slightly busier, and then he realized that before the call it had been the other way around, and that in fact there had been areas of both the new and old gift that had been all but abandoned. At one point as they rode, one of the older men had stiffened at the sight of a farm being worked on to one side, ridden up to Will, asked something, and then on getting a nod had ridden off at the gallop to the farm. An hour later he had rejoined them, snuffling and wiping at his eyes. "That farm was me," thus he muttered when someone asked him what was amiss. "Grew up there. Me brother inherited it and I joined the watch. Volunteered, family tradition. Eldest inherits the farm, second to the wall, others leave for elsewhere. Me brother Daryl, that was well, he died in a wilderling raid when he was trading with another farm, so his son took it over. And he closed up and took his family, wife and 3 bens south because of the raids 2 years ago. Now he's back. He's back. Farming hard. Son's growing. Daughter doing well." And then he blew his nose on a rag and didn't say another word for several hours. Something that nagged at him a little as they rode north after that was that more than a few of the people working in the fields seemed to be wearing furs, or in some cases were stripped to the waist, below which they were wearing furs. Some were in the middle of what looked like intent conversations with men and women who were dressed in less warm clothes that looked better suited. "Wildlings." He muttered the word to his neighbor, who nodded and looked as if he wanted to hawk and spit to one side. He eyed the men in furs carefully and then wondered how the people that father had once described as animals were dealing with civilization. Not too long after that he had his answer when they saw a head on a spike by the side of the road. Will looked about and then raised a hand to stop them, as he called out to a man working in a field to one side. The man strode over and then gestured at the head. "You wondering who he was? A wilderling. Fool tried to rape my daughter. She's got a good set o' lungs on her, and we got the shit before he could do anything other than scare her and show what a small cock he had. Then they came." They who? "The Thun. Patrols of them go around where the wildlings are. Knock heads together when they have to." He looked around at them and then grinned a rather unsettling grin. "Lord Stark told that king beyond the wall, Raider, that his wildlings had to obey the laws of the north when they came south of the wall. And the Thun are sworn to Lord Stark. They obey his orders, so when he told them to keep order they bloody well do it. They listened to what we all had to say, and then they had that would-be rapist of my girl on his knees before they took his head clean off with a sword. People respect the Thun. Scary buggers." They rode on after that and he spent some time in thought. If he remembered correctly, the Thun were from a valley to the north of the wall and wore bronze. And there had been that odd earless man in Winterfell who Tyrion had said was a Maga, or Magna or something like that, of the Thun. So Ned Stark had his own private army of men armed with bronze. He scoffed internally. And then, several hours later, and as the sun started to drift down towards the horizon, he saw something odd up ahead. Peculiar shapes on things that did not move as horses did. Will spotted them as well and had them pause for a moment. "Giants up ahead," he said. "On mammoths too. Watch your horses, they might not like the sight or smell of them." He looked about. "They'll smell us coming, if this wind keeps true." Giants. Tyrion had spoken of them. But it was one thing to hear of them and another to see them. They were like huge shaggy men, covered with what at first he thought were cloths made from fur, but which at second glance was actual fur. Their arms were longer than those of a man and their faces subtly different. Seeing them on their mammoths was, well, it drove home everything that Tyrion had told him. If they had not been real enough before, things were certainly real enough now. He could tell at a glance that the giants, there were about 20 of them, were wary of the men, muttering amongst themselves in the language of the first men. Or something close to that. He listened carefully as the leader of the giants talked to Will, but he did not have Tyrion's ear for language. Even so, he could tell that the Will was a bit surprised by what they said. And then there was the odd thing. At one point the giant doing all the talking seemed to sniff the air with great snuffling snorts and then looked straight at Jaime for a moment. Will talked to them a bit more and then rejoined them. "Giants are heading south out of the gift," he told the group as they rode on. They were the last of their kind to come south of the wall, so they are joining their kind on the eastern foothills of the northern mountains, away from men like the mountain clans and their fields of barley that their mammoths think is grass. Then he shook his head in thought. They were talking to Lord Umber about breeding a hairier kind of cattle. They are good at husbandry. Good at growing things too. He caught the baffled look that was on Jaime's face. They eat no meat, Lannister. Ignore the tales. They don't eat men. They are just wary of us. Why? You Will said grimly. They smelled you. Baffled, he stared at the man. Smelled me? Do I smell so bad? Will shook his head. No, they smelled the magic on you, or at least I think that's what they said. The giants said that the eyes of the old gods were on you, but could not say if that was good or bad. The other men looked at him, as unsettled as he now felt. He almost wanted to stare at the sky. Wasn't that where the old gods were? Or were they in the white trees? Is the great John on the road then? Herrick, a slight dark-haired man who seemed almost ambivalent to Jaime compared to the others at times, asked as they resumed their ride. I said Will, and true enough they soon encountered him as they reached a large inn on the road and secured rooms for the night. The inn looked as if it had recently been expanded, given the fresh look of some of the walls, but fortunately the party from the last hearth was a small one. Not that Jaime was keen to meet the Lord of the last hearth. The last time he had seen the Great Oath was at Pike, but the time before that had been at the Red Keep. Both times he had regarded Jaime as a piece of dung on his boot. He was loud, boisterous, ate a lot, drank a lot and sang a lot when drunk. And he hadn't changed very much. He reminded him of the Fat King before the call. So Jaime kept his head down, unsaddled his horse, scrubbed the stink of the road off with a pitcher of hot water and some rags, and then chose the darkest corner of the main room of the inn to get some supper. It sort of worked. He heard Will walking to the loud Lord of the last hearth, who was incapable of talking softly and who confirmed that yes, he had been talking to giants to get some ideas about a different kind of cattle. He avoided people's eyes and waited until at last a serving girl brought him some mutton in gravy with bread and a mug of ale. As he ate and drank he brooded. The eyes of the old gods were on him, were they? He didn't know what to make of that. Should he be fearful? What were they watching him for? What was happening to him? All of a sudden, over these past months, everything that he thought he knew had been upended, ripped up, destroyed. His sins had been discovered, he had been condemned despite the good deeds that he had done, good deeds that had placed King's Landing at risk. It took an effort to swallow, the food and drink were as ashes in his mouth. He looked up as the men and women in the room laughed at something that the large-boned Lord of the last hearth had said, and all of a sudden he had to get out. The room was too hot all of a sudden, the laughter too loud, the smells of the food and the people too much. He stood quietly and slipped out, seeking the door to the outside. As he closed the door behind him and inhaled the cool air, he looked up. The stars were shining down on him and he realized that the hour was later than he had realized. Somewhere those same stars were shining down on Tyrion and his Daisy, on Tommen and Myrcella and Cersei. Cersei. She was the reason why he was here, she was the reason why all of his decisions in the past decade and a half had been wrong, foolish, stupid. He both loved and hated her now. He'd warned her that they could be found out, but she'd always laughed and told him now to be silly. Well, now here he was. A ruined former Kingsguard, shamed beyond measure, an embarrassment to his family, now headed to a life of service in exile at the arse end of the world. Fighting the Snooks and Grumpkins that he once doubted even existed. He looked out at the darkened landscape bleakly, and then he reached up and his fingers closed around the pouch that hung around his neck and which held the ashes of his white cloak. For a moment he wanted to pull that pouch off, hurl it at the moon and then walk off into the darkness, to walk until he couldn't walk anymore and then crawl away to die on some naked hillside of hunger or thirst or exposure. Would that be desertion though? Would the old gods kill him quickly or slowly for walking away? He'd sworn an oath on the Fist of Winter. Would he die like Bootle had, according to Tyrion? Or, what? All of a sudden he realized that he was not alone. He turned his head and saw that for such a large man Great John Umber could move surprisingly quietly. Umber. Lannister. The big man tilted his head a little and looked at him. Saw you slip out. I've seen that look on the face of a few men before. What look? The look of a man who wants to stop living. He shook his head. It seems that there are a lot of men of the North who owe you their lives, including me. He laughed harshly. Gods, I always thought you an oath-breaking little cunt who liked to lick your father's ass. And now all kinds of truths have been unearthed. You killed heirs to save King's Landing. Not your father's army, not the rebel army, the ordinary people of King's Landing. You've got balls on you, lad. He looked away. I should have told someone, he said thickly after a moment. About the wildfire. It's been secured, the great John grunted as he stepped forwards. Got a raven the other day. King's Landing is safe. He felt his shoulders relax a little. Good. The great John looked him up and down again. So, you're bound for the wall now? I am. I was told you swore your oath on the fist, in front of the old gods, with red fire in the eyes of Ned Stark. I've been there when that happened. Almost scared me shitless. Now that was a terrifying thought. And then Jaime jumped a little as the large man next to him laid a huge hand on his shoulder. The wall and the Night's Watch is honorable service, Lannister. Don't be stupid and try and end yourself. Like I said, I've seen it before. Winters are hard up here, and there are times when a man's gone for a walk in the snow and never returned because his portion of food can be given to his children or grandchildren. No, there's a fight ahead for you. I'm told you're a good swordsman. There's going to be a war on the wall. You're needed. You know what's out there now. Whites. Others. Creatures from nightmares. They're fighting. The big man visibly struggled for words. And then, after a great shout of laughter came from the inn, he hooked a thumb back at it. They are fighting against that. Life. Laughter. Song. They want to pinch us out like you snuff out a candle. No more songs. No more life. No babes being born. No life. Just death. You, me, your brother, everyone dead. If you're going to fight for anything, fight for that. He remembered that nightmare he had had about the fall of the rock and shuddered a little. Another slap on the shoulder almost sent him reeling as the great John turned and then winked at a giggling barmaid who had truly impressive cleavage and who was waiting at the door. Fight for a pretty face and tits to bury your face in. It was an odd battle cry, but then he was gone. Jaime stood in the dark and clutched at the pouch again. And then he sighed and went back inside. He needed ale and sleep. John Stark. There wasn't a maester in Barrowtown, but there were various people who could patch people up, and he had to admit that they had done a fairly good job on father and himself. The stitches itched a bit, days later, but he was pleased with himself afterwards. Barrowtown had rejoiced, free of the mysterious fog, free of the fear of the voices in the fog. Before they'd left on the way south, father had taken Lord and Lady Dustin, who had been tiptoeing around each other like two cats around a patch of sunlight, into Lady Dustin's solar and then talked to them for just short of an hour. Whatever had been said in that room he did not know, but he did note that the two were standing closer together at the gate to see them off than they had ever been before, by his estimation at least. Father had only grunted, "Gods, I wish Cat was here," to knock their heads further together, and then acknowledged the cheers of the crowd before saying just one word more: "Ride." And now here they were, sailing south down the Barrow River. Apparently Asher Greyjoy's ship would join them when the river joined the sea, and then they would separate into their respective parties and sail off. If there was one thing that he was already grateful for on this trip, it was that it had driven home how little he ever wanted to be king of anything. Stannis Baratheon would occasionally have messages delivered via message pouches by riders from nearby holdfasts in the few places where they could dock. And by all the gods, many of those messages were, in the words of the Hand of the King, nothing but dross messages from all kinds of lords for favors or about minor matters. And some of them were so minor that he wanted to laugh in astonishment. But, as father put it, great matters were made from 1,000 small things. And he never wanted to deal with that many small things. He was going to be very happy with a castle of his own here in the north. If, that is, he survived the war on the wall. And if he survived this bloody voyage, because he was increasingly sure that Ygritte Redhair was trying to drive him raving mad. She seemed to be as inconstant as the wind, blowing at him from one direction and then another. She went from laughing at him with Asher Greyjoy, to making comments about his ass that made his cheeks flame, to just giving him challenging looks. He had no idea at times what to do. So now, after a particularly annoying bout of giggling by Grit and Asher about him, he stomped away from them both, up along the deck and then stood by the mainmast and fumed quietly, with Ghost watching him. Far ahead of him Father was talking quietly with Lord Stannis. You shouldn't let them get to you that much. He turned to one side and saw that Theon Greymist was sitting to one side, Mist next to him, both staring at the shore as it passed by. I thought you were in your cabin. I'm here. Staring and thinking. What about? The former Ironborn pulled a face. Within a week I'll be face to face with my father again. The father whose legacy and heritage I've renounced. I've been rehearsing what to say to him. He'll be angry, he'll shout about me becoming a Greenlander, he'll tell me I'm a disgrace to the name of House Greyjoy, before giving me orders about going back to the king and demanding I take it all back. He shrugged. I'll just tell him that what's done is done. I am of the North now. A Greenlander. He ran his hand affectionately over the top of Mist's head, smiling a little as the direwolf tried to lick his hand. Yes, he had changed. We'll be with you, Jon muttered. And the hand of the king. Your father will try in vain to order you about. A complex look flashed across Theon's face, a combination of dread, fear, resolve and determination. If he orders that Mist be harmed, I'll kill him myself. There was a long moment of silence and then Theon looked at him wryly. Father won't be happy with my choice of a wife. But damn what he says. Jon looked back at him. You are sure about this? I mean. Theon, he could not finish the sentence. She's a whore, Theon said with a grim smile, before shrugging. I love her. She loves me. I don't care what people will say. I have a chance to be happy and I mean to take it. You know what's coming at the war. I might not survive the war. But I'll do my best to found a House Greymist on the stony shore and build the North a fleet for its western approaches. And maybe in 100 years my descendants will just be known as a bit less Ironborn and a bit more northern. He shrugged. It's my decision. And you need to be happy too. Marry that ginger of yours. She's a wilderling. Or rather free folk, you know. It's not that easy, Theon. I'm a Stark now. And I don't know what she wants. She drives me mad sometimes. He looked at the prow of the boat, where Stannis Baratheon had finished his talk with Father and was now walking back along the other side of the ship. She wants you, Theon grinned. So don't be so daft. Stop brooding, you daft bugger. Take a chance and be happy. He sighed and then looked at the shore again. Jon left him there, obviously thinking again about the talk with Balon Greyjoy that was to come, and then strode up to Father, who was standing near the bowsprit as the wind ruffled his hair. Father. Jon. Father looked at him and then looked back along the length of the ship at the others. How goes things? Theon is set on marrying Ros, no matter what anyone else says. Asher Greyjoy has been telling the captain that if he reset his sails a bit, this lubbersome scow, whatever that means, might move faster, and Ygritte is, being herself. Father actually laughed at this and then shook his head. You'll come to understand women, in time. He tilted his head. I did. Eventually. As for Theon, I understand what he's doing. He's changed a lot. He had to. We accept him, and that's the important bit. As for Ygritte, well, she's a challenge. He looked at Father, confused. I thought that you'd be against me pursuing her. I mean, I'm a Stark now and she's a wilderling. Father's face stilled for a moment and then he turned to look downriver. What do you see? Confused, he also looked in the same direction. I don't understand. The river. All right, what don't you see? Now he was really confused. I'm sorry, Father, but, what? And now Father sighed a little. How many towns have we sailed past? Villages. Docks. How many boats have we seen? Not big ships like this, rowing boats or coracles. Jon looked at the river. Not many, he conceded. Why? The North is huge, Jon. But its population is not. The people are brave and hardy and know how to farm here but aren't numerous, not compared to the South. Life here is hard. We've had pestilence and hard winters. And the hardest winter of all since ancient times is coming. Father turned to him and John swallowed at the intent look on his face. And we have been given a chance to increase the population of the north by many thousands. Not through the call, but by letting the wildlings past the gates on the wall. Understanding blossomed. You want to add the wildlings to the north? I do. Father placed a hand on his shoulder. I talked to Mance Rayder a lot before we left Winterfell. He thinks the same way that I do on this. We do not know how long this war on the wall, this second long night, will last. Rayder led more than 100,000 south of the wall, and the exact number is still climbing. Those who live beyond the wall find life south of it easier than where they lived before. They grew crops north of the wall in some places. Think of what they can do in the gift, the new gift, and south of there. He thought about this for a long moment and then nodded reluctantly before a thought occurred to him. But, won't they want to return to their homes afterwards? Will they? Father tilted his head. If they have good lives south of the wall, why should they? Yes, there are some who will refuse to bend the knee, and they will be able to return to north of the wall after this war is over. But there are others who have agreed already to obey our laws, the laws of the north, whilst they live amongst us. And they will get used to that. They'll settle in areas and grow crops and build houses to live in during the coming winter, and they'll get used to that. Being safe. Warmer climes than they've been used to. Now that we know what went wrong, between the wildlings and the Night's Watch and the north as a whole, we can mend things. Make things better. We and they share the same blood, the blood of the first men. We should be allies, not enemies. That's my goal. I've talked this over with Robb and Rayder. And now you know my intentions. So we need to make the wildlings think that we no longer regard them as scum. It'll take time. Effort. Marriage alliances. All kinds of things. He stood there for a long moment, feeling stunned. You would not look amiss at a marriage between a Stark and a wildling. Father smiled at him. No, and I would be a hypocrite if I did. At least one Lord Stark in the past has been half wildling. The pack does what it can do to survive. And I will do everything that I can to let the North survive the winter that comes and then thrive after that. You're planning for after the war, before the war has been fought. And now Father looked at him in a truly intent manner. Always have a plan. A lord who does not plan is no lord, not here in the north or anywhere. You must always have a vision for your people and then let them know that you have such a plan. They will know then that you are thinking of them, of their well-being. And they know that you are planning for victory. John nodded slowly. I understand, Father. Good. Because winter is coming. And with that they both looked downstream. Chapter 46, Chapter 46. Chapter text. Robb. Temptation was a terrible thing. Grey Wolf's reaction to having a piece of bacon or a lamb chop dangled before his eyes was to try and lunge for it as fast as possible. He had to exercise more patience than that himself. He knew how badly he had handled things in that world that was now no more. Marrying Jane Westerling had been the path of honor but not the path of political sense. Had he loved her, truly? With all his heart? He could not say. He had told himself he had, but how real had that been? And the cost? Seeing Lord Westerling again, even if the man had been perfectly respectful, dutiful even, had been a wrench back to those last moments in the dark hall at the Twins. And now here he was, free to marry anyone he wanted up to a point. He knew that he had to take this matter more carefully than before, that he had to make a match that would strengthen the North as it faced this moment of peril. A second long night. The danger from north of the wall that he had never known existed in that other time. A danger every bit as deadly as the long arm of Tywin Lannister, more so in fact. He couldn't marry Val. It would be a terrible mistake, he was sure of it. Too many lords in the north would look askance at it. She was a wildling, and even if the wildlings were now allied to the north, even if Father's great plan to bind them to the north worked in the long term, there were still too many memories of wildling raids, of theft, of murders, kidnappings and rapes. No, many lords in the north expected him to marry someone safe and northern, like Daisy Mormont or one of the Karstark girls. Others even hoped that he might marry someone like Margaery Tyrell, allying the North firmly to the huge harvests of the Reach. He'd never met the girl, but a lot of people talked of bounteous harvests a great deal when they spoke of her, so it might have also been a reference to her chest. He wasn't sure. Val instead was merely the good sister to Mance Rayder, the sort of former king beyond the wall and the man who was probably going to head up House Rayder when the king reached the wall and made sure that the wildlings were behaving themselves. She was beautiful, brave, extremely capable, clever. She knew that was all but a hostage in Winterfell, and above all she was lethal with that knife of hers. Some men had been a bit free with their language around her. She'd smilingly promised to geld the first man who tried his luck too far. From the way that she'd handled that dagger, Robb and everyone else had believed her. She was also easy to talk to, careful in her judgments, respectful of the North, and something else, something that he could not put his finger on. Conversations with her were something to be remembered afterwards, treasured even, because she always got to the heart of the matter. And now here he was, after saying goodbye to her just moments before, walking down a corridor and resisting, no, fighting the urge to go back and talk to her again. He sighed. Grey Wind was hunting again with the other direwolves, and that was something else that he needed to think about with every day that passed. His connection with his direwolf grew stronger and deeper, as if a key had been turned in his mind. He needed to. Someone let out a noise that he knew at once was the sound of someone dying very quickly and violently not too far away, and he turned on the spot, his hand going to the long knife that he always made sure he had on him at all times. Then there was a horrible cracking noise, a choking gurgle, the sound of a body hitting first stonework and then the floor, and then as he stared down the corridor in the direction of all of this, something was flung into view from a side corridor. It hit the floor with a dreadful wet noise. It was a severed lower jaw of a human being. And then Robb heard the beginning of what sounded like a shout of alarm. A female voice. Cut short with an irk of shock. He darted down the corridor quickly to the junction and then looked at a scene of horror. The Mountain was standing there, looking as if he had dressed in a hurry. At his feet lay the dreadful remains of the two Lannister guardsmen that he knew had been detached to watch the unstable brute of a man at all times. Both of their heads were horribly mangled and one had lost his lower jaw. But that was not what drew his horrified attention. The Mountain was holding Val by the throat in what looked like a grip of iron. Her face was going red and she was scrabbling for her dagger. Clegane. Robb roared the word with fury and not a little fear. The man looked as if he was deranged. Not that the roar disturbed him. The Mountain reached out with his free hand, grabbed the front of Val's bodice and ripped downwards, tearing the cloth off her. Her dagger was in her hand now and she stabbed desperately at the Mountain's arm. Blood flew as she sliced a truly wicked cut, but Gregor Clegane did not utter a word. Val's eyes met Robb's and he could tell that she was terrified. Clegane. He bellowed the word again and then darted down the corridor, his eyes searching for a better weapon. The guards had had knives as well, not that they had done them much good, and he wished, desperately, for a sword. Perhaps if he leapt on Clegane's back and held his knife to his neck. He prepared to throw himself at the huge man, and then with a jerk and a speed that he hadn't thought the man had, the Mountain released Val and her torn bodice and whirled to face him. He realized then what had terrified Val, who had slumped to the ground, taking in air with great whooping gulps. The Mountain's eyes were jet black, every part of them, and his face was blank of all emotion. The huge man looked at him impassively and then he lunged at him. Robb slashed at one upraised hand and then ducked under the other, but it was horribly close and he knew that if the Mountain got a hold of him he was as good as dead. He dodged, slashed and then hurled himself back as one huge fist passed through the spot where his head had been a heartbeat before. This was a desperate fight for time and life, and he wished that he had the breath to spend on a scream for help, but he needed every gasp of terrified air that he could snatch. He slashed again at a lunging hand, drawing a lot of blood, and then danced back again. And then, suddenly, the Mountain shuddered and looked down, and he could see that the half-naked Val had plunged her knife into the back of the man's knee, before scrabbling back as fast as she could, searching for another knife from one of the dead guards. The Mountain looked at her and then turned to confront Robb again, who used the opportunity to drive his knife into the right eyeball of the Mountain, driving it home with the heel of his other hand. The Mountain stood there and quivered for a long moment, too long. Robb's spirits had soared for a moment, before plummeting as the Mountain jerked forwards yet again to try and punch him. He was clumsier than before, but how in the name of the old gods could a man with a dagger in his head and another embedded in his knee still be walking and fighting? He fell back, until he heard a weak call of Robb, and then looked down as one of the dead guard's knives clattered at his feet, thrown by Val. He dived down to get it and then staggered as a great fist grazed his forehead. It was just a near miss, but it still came close to dazing him and he reeled back, the knife barely in his hand. There was a wall now behind him and he gripped the knife more firmly and prepared to sell his life dearly. At least he was leading the man or whatever he was away from Val. His head was ringing and he shook it to try and clear it as the mountain brought up another massive fist. But then, before it could be swung at him, there was a crunching noise and then the blooded tip of a sword emerged from the chest of Gregor Clegane. The huge man froze, looked down slowly, and only then did he slump down to his knees, revealing the form of a panting Sander Clegane, who looked as if he had run quickly. Far behind him, holding her hands to her face, was the maid that he had seen flirting with the hound. The mountain looked at him and then his remaining eye flashed between black and blue. "You fucking great idiot," the mountain suddenly said in words of almost amused despair that sounded nothing like his normal voice. "That's the wrong bloody Stark." Robb stared at him and then he rammed his borrowed knife straight into that eye and twisted it as hard as he could. The mountain jerked again, drool dribbling from his mouth, and then Robb nodded at the hound, who pulled his sword free and then, with one mighty swing, hacked the head of his brother off his shoulders. As the head bounced wetly on the floor, Robb nodded in gratitude at the hound. "My thanks, Clegane." And then he pulled off his jerkin and staggered over to Val, giving it to her so that she could cover her exposed breasts. "Are you all right?" "You saved my life," she said hoarsely. "I owe you a great debt." She stared at the body of the mountain. He was possessed. Robb nodded, his attention torn between Val and the hound, who was on his knees now as he stared at the body of his monstrous brother. And then Val reached at his face, pulling it around. "Burn his body," she hissed vehemently. "Burn it." Something dark had him. She paused, her eyes searching his face, searching for words. So he did what he had wanted to do for some time. He kissed her passionately. Yes, he was being a fool again. Jamie. By the time that they caught sight of Castle Black, he had finally more or less started to cope with the impact that the wall had taken on him. The moment that he had seen it for the first time, that line of white on the horizon, he'd pulled a slight face. And then, when he heard that they were still a day or more from it, he'd uneasily remembered what Tyrion had said about it. Yes, it was something that had to be seen to be believed. Men would not have built such a thing if they had not had a truly pressing reason. An enemy. Something to the north that truly terrified them. They had built it and then they had maintained the bloody thing. And that was the thing that scared him. If the whites were real, then what else lay beyond the wall? He remembered Tyrion's tale of the others that he had fought his little brother, fighting for his life. And he remembered the look on Tyrion's face. There had been fear on it. Resolution as well, but fear as he described things that were so inhuman. So as they rode towards the gates that had a trickle of people traveling in both directions, he had to admit to a certain trepidation that he was trying to suppress. The wall loomed over them all, massive, oppressive even. This was his future. He'd live and die here. There was no doubt about that in his mind, not now. War was marching on the wall, he could almost smell it. He'd been wondering what the various ghosts who were flitting about his shoulders would have thought of that. What would Aes have thought? Simple, it was all a plot and the North would have to burn for it. Roriger. Had Roriger foreseen it, in those strange moments that the man had, with his obsession with the Song of Ice and Fire? If he had, then why had he helped his father set the realm on fire? What had he seen on the Isle of Faces? As they approached the gates, one of the men around him pulled out a horn and sent up a short blast with it, which was met with an upraised spear by one of the men at the entrance. Some of the people coming through the gate heading south were covered in furs and looked thin and tired, but looking as if they were only just starting to realize that they were now safe. Inside the gates he could see that the place was abuzz with activity. Wagons were being loaded and unloaded, all kinds of tools and weapons visible. A forge was being used to one side, the sound of several men pounding on iron ringing in the air. And someone in the distance was singing a song about someone or something called Lion Fang, a song that he'd never heard of before. As he dismounted he could see that Will was already striding up to a thin-faced man in black who was talking to a pair of men in bronze armor. He seemed to be searching for words at times, using gestures that the other seemed to think about and then nod at. They talked for a few moments longer and then the two men in bronze nodded formally, brought sheathed knives to their chests in an odd gesture and then walked away. The thin-faced man watched them go with an odd look to his face, before turning to greet Will with a nod. As they talked Jamie frowned slightly. Ah. He remembered him now. Thorne. Alisa Thorne. A Targaryen loyalist that father had exiled to the Night's Watch. Thorne's gaze turned to him and he concealed a sigh. He knew what was coming. And true enough Thorne stalked over to him and then looked him over from head to toe before smiling a very thin and utterly humorless smile. Ah. The Kingslayer. Here, at last, years late. He pulled a slight face, as if trying to remember the name of the man. I think I remember you from King's Landing. Rose, isn't it? Or something like that. The thin smile didn't waver at all. Oh, I remember you. The arrogant little whelp of Tywin Lannister, with your pretty, shiny, armor. The smile vanished and he sniffed contemptuously. Well, so much for your armor. You're at the wall now. And for all your japes about forgetting my name, well, you know it, I see it in your eyes. If anyone up here forgets yours we'll just call you Kingslayer. Or Sister Fucker. We know all about what you did and why you did it. All of it. Something flickered in his gaze. You know why I killed Aerys Targaryen then, Jamie said softly. Why I did what I did. I know, Thorne said through gritted teeth. And then, after a visible struggle, you saved the city. Urs was mad. But you never told anyone why you did what you did. The man pulled a face again. Well. Now you're here. With us. On the wall. Fighting against things from your darkest nightmares. At least you've sworn your oath. And I don't need to tell you that if you break it you'll die. I know. The words felt as tired as he felt. I swore it on the Fist of Winter. Some of the watching men muttered at that, with a few walking off and then talking with many a backwards look at him. He had no doubt that some were laying bets on if he'd ever try to break his oath and if so the manner of his death. Thorne swept him with another gaze that combined contempt with scorn. There's quarters prepared for you. You'll need equipment. But get up to the Maester first to get that scar of yours looked at. And then he walked away from him, dismissing him. He gazed about the place for a long moment, before walking off and asking for directions. A woman with a piercing gaze and the garb of a wilderling led him to a door in the largest building, where she knocked carefully and then after a muffled "come," ushered him in. The Maester of Castle Black was impossibly old, but then, as the man looked up from the letter that he seemed to be writing, Jamie felt a shudder roll through him as the sight of those violet eyes reminded him that the Maester of Castle Black was a Targaryen. For a moment he stood there, almost rooted to the spot, before the woman jabbed him in the back and he stumbled forwards. My thanks, Jen, the old man said with a wry smile. Ah. Sir Jaime Lannister, is it not? Your description was passed on. And you have the look of a Lannister. He nodded abruptly, gestured at his cheek and then sat heavily on the nearest seat, his mind on the past. You, his throat was dry. You are Aemon Targaryen. The old man looked at him with those impossibly young eyes, before quirking his lips for a moment almost in amusement. I am, he acknowledged. I am also the Maester of Castle Black, pledged to the Night's Watch for almost twice the age that you have been alive. Let me take a look at that scar and those stitches that I feel should be removed. What followed was a little painful as the stitches were carefully observed and then pulled out, before the scar was stared at most intently. Well now, the old man said as he washed his hands in the bowl of hot water that Jen had brought in. You have been lucky, my boy. Lewin did a fine job on that scar of yours, with excellent stitches. It should not leave as much of a scar as you might have thought, a fine white line perhaps. Given the circumstances it might have been worse. That said, don't scratch it, no matter how it itches. Thank you, Jamie said, staring at his boots. Thank you. I sense unspoken words in the air, the Maester sighed. Sir Jaime, I do not blame you or hate you for killing my mad great-nephew. Aerys was quite insane at the end and word has reached us about why you killed him. I know it could not have been easy, but you killed him for the right reasons, something that few else could have done at the time. My boy, you were right. About that at least anyway. The tightness in his chest loosened a little. I still should have saved the others. The old man smiled wryly at him. You could not have known what your father was planning. Tywin Lannister always did prefer the darker gambits of the Game of Thrones. A brutally direct man, at times, your father. That said, here we are now. On the wall. Facing the war that truly matters. We must place the past behind us. He hefted the wet cloth and wiped it carefully over the scar. May I ask what is in that pouch? Jaime pulled a face. He thought for a moment about lying or just leaving, but he was tired and wearied in his own mind. The ashes of my white cloak. Sir Barristan Selmy said that I should keep it with me to remind me of what I should be. And Uncle Geryon said that he'd had a dream about that pouch, that I need to keep it with me, as without it I'll lose myself. The Maester of Castle Black stiffened when he heard the words dream. Ah, he said carefully. Dreams. Strange, nebulous things. Not things to be ignored. Never that. He fixed Jaime with an intent look. Your uncle and his son have them. I think that your brother might be touched by them. And you? Confused, he shook his head. I don't know. Are they of the future? Sometimes. A future amongst many perhaps. Your brother once told me of a dream he had had about leading the remains of the men of the Westerlands from Casterly Rock after the others and their wights had taken it. He remembered the dream he had had and he blanched a little. But then he shook his head. Madness. Aemon Targaryen looked at him for a long moment, his head tilted slightly to one side. Tell me about it when you are ready, he said shrewdly. In the meantime, be welcome to Castle Black. He nodded, acknowledged the presence of the silent witness to all this, the woman Jen, and then walked to the door. Then he paused. There was someone singing a song in the courtyard when I arrived. Something about Lion Fang. I was curious. What's that about? Oh, just a song about your brother Tyrion, the Maester said with a cheerful smile. You should listen to it. And with that he returned to his desk, as Jen fussed around him. Tyrion. He stood there, watching the funeral pyre, watching the mountain burn. The pyre had been built outside the walls of Winterfell, built to the exact specifications that he and Maester Lewin had drawn up, designed to burn hard and fast and as thoroughly as possible. He was the only person there, at the pyre. No one was there to mourn Sir Gregor Clegane. No one probably would ever mourn the man. He had been fundamentally unlovable. Had anyone ever loved him? Perhaps his parents, when he was a child. Before he'd done such terrible things. Well, not now. Sandor Clegane was conspicuous in his absence at the pyre. He was doubtless with the maid he had been escorting back to his room when she had heard the noises that turned out to be Gregor fucking Clegane indulging in his favorite pastime of gratuitous, pointless, violence, before trying to kill Robb Stark and Val. He sighed as he watched the body burn. Wretched, wretched, man. All that Clegane had ever done had been to ruin people's lives. At least he'd been put out of whatever misery he had been in. Tyrion had long suspected that there had been something very, very, wrong with him. Had he hit his head as a child? Had there been some injury to his brain? It would explain so much. Something shifted in the pyre and he tensed a little and then looked back at the walls of Winterfell off behind him. That was something that everyone had agreed on, that the body should be burned away from Winterfell, downwind of any habitation. He looked back. No, it was just the pyre collapsing a little as the body burned. He shook his head a little. It had been bad enough when the head had twisted a little as the muscles and tendons within it had tightened in the fire, making it grin in a death's head rictus for a long moment that had made his heart pound in fear for a long moment. He looked down at the warnings. They had long since stopped glowing that ugly red color and vibrating in his hands as if they were trying to get away from the body. That had shaken him. It had been Dace's idea to test the body as if it had been a white. The red glow and the vibrations had shocked everyone to stillness and then to immediate action. The pyre had been designed. The body, and severed head, had been dragged off with hooks and ropes, The blood had been soaked up with sawdust that had been brushed into buckets and later used on the pyre, and above all no one had wanted to even lay a finger on the corpse of Sir Gregor fucking Clegane. Val's words of he was possessed by dark magic had resonated throughout Winterfell. A lot of oil and cooking fat had been poured over the body, at the express desire of Lady Stark, and it had been worth it. The pyre roared once again as the body slipped down into the heart of the flames as more wood gave way, and he sighed, stared at the warnings carefully once again, and only then did he walk off back to Winterfell, careful to walk around the pyre and avoid the greasy flames. There was a pair of rather worried guards on the main gates of Winterfell, and as he approached them he held up one of the warnings and pulled it partly out of its sheath. "They've stopped glowing," he reassured them. "It's gone, whatever it was." "That's good to hear, my lord," one of them sighed, looking relieved. "Lord Robb sent word asking that you go to Lord Stark's solar, where your wife is." He nodded and then trudged off. What a day. He was so tired. The aftermath of the Mountain's attack on Robb and Val had been total chaos, a lot of shouting, a lot of staring, and above all a lot of absolute fury on his part. Gregor fucking Clegane. The man had been a walking disaster, killing on a whim and spreading his own brand of horror on the world. And he had been from the Westerlands. He narrowed his eyes as he stumped determinedly down the corridor. When had all this started? Why had the Mountain not accompanied father to Castle Black? What had been going through what passed for the man's brain? He had too many questions and not enough answers. As he approached the solar he tilted his head a little in surprise. There was no sound coming from the room. However, the guard nodded at him, knocked on the door and then allowed him in. There were 5 people in the room, all sitting around a table and all staring at a large and old book as if it was in fact a bag of snakes. Robb Stark had a bruise on his forehead and looked strained. He was next to Val, who had what looked like the beginning of a truly spectacular bruise on her neck and who was wearing a dress that was very northern. Lady Stark was on the other side of Robb, pale-faced and worried. Then there was Maester Lewin, who had an indecipherable look on his face, his hands tucked up his sleeves, and last but, actually first in his thoughts, Daisy, who turned to look at him and then smiled, hurried over and kissed him. "You need to see this," she said softly. He nodded at her, walked over to the nearest chair at the table and sat on it, before pulling out one of the warnings. "He's as dead can be," he muttered. "The warnings have stopped glowing and shuddering in my hands." He shook his head. "When the fire dies down, I suggest that the ashes of the wretched man be collected and then thrown into the nearest river. That or a small hole in the ground." There was a collective nod of various heads, and then Tyrion looked at the current Stark in Winterfell. "Robb, on behalf of... as the most senior Lannister here, I would like to apologize for the attack of one of our bannermen on you." "Rubbish, cousin or good cousin, or whatever it is," Robb snorted. "There's nothing to apologize for. The man was possessed." He pointed at the book. "And we think we know how." Tyrion peered at the book. It was old, at least a century or more at least, and it had a name on the spine that was faint in places, and... He felt his eyes widen to a ridiculous extent. The title was Fell Practices of Valyria, by Archmaester Chalion. Where he paused and then pitched his voice a bit lower to remove the squeak. "Where did you get that from? I was under the impression that there was only one copy of that in all of Westeros, and that copy is in the restricted section of the Citadel." "It was in the hidden room in this solar," Robb Stark said in a rather odd tone of voice. "You should read the name written inside the front cover." Frowning a little, he pulled the huge old book towards him and opened it to the suggested page. "Ah. Torrhen Stark," it said in a somewhat spidery scrawl. "Torrhen Stark," he mused. "Ah. The king who knelt." Robb said flatly. "And now we know why." He frowned harder and then he blinked. "Ah," he said wonderingly as he leafed carefully through the first pages of the book, wincing a little at some of the words that leapt off the pages, words like death, flesh smith, suborned and fire. He was afraid that the Targaryens had access to these practices and the dragons. "Yes, I do see and understand why he knelt." He looked up sharply. "You think that there is a connection between this book and the Mountain?" Daisy gently took the book from him, leafed carefully through it to a certain page and then placed the book in front of him. He read quickly but carefully, dread poling in his stomach, as well as bile as he comprehended what he was reading. Good gods, he said eventually in a rather faint voice, and then took the proffered goblet of wine that his wife had very thoughtfully poured for him. Yes, by the description that was what you saw. The black eyes fit the ritual. This is all we have, though, a description of the magic that the Valyrians could do, not how to do it. Chalion restricted himself just to describing what they could do and not how to do it, Lewin said softly, his hands up his sleeves and his eyes on the fire. Good. I don't want to know more. Neither do I, said Tyrion with a shiver. So the Valyrians had a version of warging into men and women. Which is evil, Val said hoarsely, her windpipe obviously bruised as well as her neck. No warg north of the wall will ever warg into a fellow man. It's said to be an evil act that never ends well. An animal is one thing, Robb muttered. Although I think that the direwolves, it's complicated there. Warging into a direwolf is allowed by the animal. Protection for protection. A man or woman, though. I can see why it's seen as evil. As the Valyrians themselves thought at first, Chalion writes, Tyrion said as he reread what was written. Yes,